Good evening and welcome to Chrononauts, a science fiction literature history podcast. I'm Nate and I'm joined by my co-host JM. How you doing tonight?
Oh, I'm doing all right. I'm ready to face the spirits.
Yes. Tonight we're going to be talking about spiritualism. Now, spiritualism itself is a religion and a spiritual movement that is in existence to the present day, and it's even protected under law in the UK from 2009 onwards. So we're not going to be covering works of spiritualistic philosophy and other accounts of contact with otherworldly spirits, but rather we're going to be covering four works tonight that are explicitly framing themselves as fiction, but present themselves in a kind of spiritualistic sense, be it the characters themselves are spiritualist or it involves some philosophy that is related to spiritualism. This episode tonight ties pretty well with the previous episode we did on mesmerism, as spiritualism and mesmerism definitely go hand in hand with one another. Though it's not necessary to have the previous episode in mind before you listen to this one. If you like the stories that are presented in this episode, certainly check out that past episode on mesmerism, as well, as they cover a lot of the same stuff in some places, but in other places they are markedly different.
Yeah, and we'll be probably doing another sort of ESP-themed episode at some point, and so we'll be revisiting some of this kind of ground.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's pretty commonly used throughout a lot of science fiction, and more so, I think, in horror fiction, but oftentimes the lines certainly blur, especially this early on. So I first came across the spiritualistic movement in doing this project, where I was reading the Encyclopedia of Fantastic Victoriana by Jess Nevins, and he had written up this incredibly strange plot description of one of the works we're going to be covering later tonight, the marvelous Voyage, or Journey, or I forget how I translate it, one of the two, of Mr. Nic-Nac. Yeah, and he mentioned that it wasn't translated in English yet, so I figured that might be an interesting challenge for us to do for the podcast. So as I was going through it, we quickly realized that it wasn't going to fit too well with other Martian voyages like Vampires of Mars or Burroughs's Barsoom series, so we decided to build an entire episode around it. And doing some of the background research on spiritualism and spiritualist and the philosophies associated with them, we thought it'd be worthwhile to give a background on the history of spiritualism itself, as it's quite a big and popular movement that was primarily in the United States and the United Kingdom, but as we'll see with some of the other stories, also spread to South America. So for a great deal of the segment we're going to do on the history of spiritualism, we're going to be drawing from a book written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who we also addressed in last episode, this time one of his works of nonfiction. He wrote a book in 1926 called The History of Spiritualism in 2 volumes. Now, Doyle was a true blue, dyed-in-the-wool believer. And
yeah, especially by this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not so much maybe when he wrote The Parasite. I mean, maybe a tad.
Yeah.
But by 1926, he was pretty embroiled in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Much to the chagrin of some people.
Yeah, he pretty much made it his life's work at that point. I mean, obviously coasting on the profits of the Sherlock Holmes series, he was able to do more or less whatever he wanted without having to worry about a paycheck coming in. And this spiritualist angle is certainly what his passion was at that point in time. So unlike a detached academic like some of the other sources we consulted for this, he is approaching the subject matter on a personal level and believes in it completely. That kind of look at the history of the movement has its pros and its cons, but I think it's important to take into consideration, as Doyle himself had conducted like 40 plus years of research into this sort of thing.
And he's not completely one-sided. He addresses some of the things against it as well.
Yeah, right, exactly. Especially early on, where it was kind of a not exactly fully formed movement, but as we'll see, it sort of congealed into a movement that's really swept the United States. Doyle himself and many spiritualists have the date of March 31st, 1848, as the beginning of the spiritualist movement. And we're going to see why that is, But Doyle spends a significant amount of time talking about some of the early precursors to what happened in 1848, as far as contact with the dead and spirits and these other kinds of supernatural, otherworldly phenomenon. So the first figure he talks about is Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a Swedish fellow that lived most of his life in Gothenburg, so it's a rather appropriate last name for him. But he's claimed by some as the father of spiritualism, even though he lived far, far before 1848. He was born in 1688 and died in 1772, and was a mining and metallurgical engineer employed by Charles XII of Sweden. And he was the author of several books on astronomy and physics. He was a zoologist, an anatomist, an economist, and a student of a Lutheran pastor, so a really well-rounded, intelligent, educated individual. But he had some very, very strange views on religion and Christianity, which were quite divergent from mainstream Christianity at the time when he was writing, which is primarily in the 1700s. And he claimed that only he, with the help of angels, is able to interpret the Bible correctly. And he approaches the Bible as some kind of obscure cipher that is waiting to be coded. So everything is this elaborate cryptic metaphor that only he has the key to unlock. Doyle doesn't really have too much patience with this for him. He says, quote, his tiresome exegesis of the scriptures, where everything means something different from what it obviously means.
Yeah. He said God wouldn't work in that way. He would be simple and straightforward.
Right, exactly. So this is one area where Doyle really differs from Swedenborg. He, that is, Swedenborg, rejects the idea of atonement and original sin, as well as the Trinity in its traditional sense, but believes there is an element of the divine in everything. So in that sense, his philosophy sounds closer to what mainstream Buddhism or Hinduism would believe, as opposed to Christianity. He claimed to have extrasensory visions, such as seeing a fire in Stockholm 300 miles away where he was in Gothenburg, and had a series of visions in 1744. The first one he described as, quote, a kind of vapor steaming from the pores of my body. So it's from this point forward where he begins making contact with spirits, and Doyle describes him as the first medium in the sense that we would consider the word today, and as Doyle considered it in his time. Obviously noting the fact that supernatural instances were documented to have happened prior to Swedenborg's time. When Swedenborg communicated with spirits, he would draw his breath for an hour and kind of induce himself in this trance-like state. This idea comes more so in the 19th century when mesmerism becomes a thing, as that is a way to contact the spirits through the mesmeric trance. Swedenborg has the revelation that the afterlife consists of a number of spheres representing various shades of luminosity and happiness, and each of us goes to that for which our spiritual condition has fitted us. Again, resembling more Hindu and Buddhist theology than Christianity. He believes that people are judged by a spiritual law that evaluates the whole of one's life. So there's no tyrant of the unnamed scenario. There's no gunfighter repentance scenario where the evil criminal repents in prison and his soul is saved. You're judged by the entirety of your life's works. He believed that upon death, it didn't change man in any meaningful way, and that there's no such thing as eternal punishment. And he believed that marriage is a form of spiritual union. In regards to him being in contact with spirits, he claimed that when Erik Brahe, a Swedish noble, was beheaded, he said that at 10 in the morning he was beheaded and spoke to me at 10 of that night. He was with me almost without interruption for several days. He said in his diary, in apt summary of positions, I think, that, quote, all confirmations in matters pertaining to theology, as it were, glued fast into the brains, and can with difficulty be removed, and while they remain, genuine truths can find no place. So Swedenborg wrote a number of books, and Doyle notes that Heaven and Hell, The New Jerusalem, and Arcana Coelestia are his most important, but he wrote dozens pretty much. Those are all freely available to read today. I think pretty much all of them have been translated into English, given how popular he was to the spiritualist movement later on. So while Swedenborg died in the late 1700s, there's still quite a gap between him and the events of 1848. And the next movements and people that he traces are Edward Irving in Scotland and the Shakers in the United States. Edward Irving was born in 1792. Doyle says of him, quote, "In person he was a giant and a Hercules in strength, his splendid physique being only marred by a bad outward cast of one eye, a defect which, like Byron's lame foot, seemed in some sort to present an analogy to the extremes in his character." Irving was trained in the old-fashioned Protestantism of the Scottish Church, and eventually broke with the Church over the question of whether Christ had in him the possibility of sin, or whether the divine portion of his being was a complete and absolute bar to physical temptations. So, I guess quite the sticking point for Irving. The official presbytery was against him on this, but he had a strong following in his own congregation. And in 1830, he heard of two sensitives named Campbell and MacDonald in West Scotland, who had started speaking in tongues in communication with the world beyond. By July 1831, members of his own congregation started doing this as well, which were described as sudden, doleful, and unintelligible sounds, also described as there was a force and fullness of the sound of which the delicate female organs would seem incapable, and it burst forth with an astounding and terrible crash. Eventually, along with their speaking in tongues, they interjected some English words in there and were saying some very, very strange things. Doyle himself thinks there probably was a true psychic origin in these phenomenon, but had developed in what he calls a soil of narrow, bigoted theology, which was bound to bring them to ruin.
Not a fan of Presbyterians.
No. And Scottish Puritanism, which I really only have experience through some of the novels from Walter Scott, seem very, very severe and extreme. Thinking that even listening to music is a distraction from your devotion to God, and you shouldn't do anything remotely like that.
And that might be coming up in an interesting way next episode, but we'll be talking about that in the end.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, more what we'll be doing next time later on, but I'm certainly looking forward to those works, and I think we'll have a nice base to build on in this and the prior episode, so that'll be cool. So Irving himself dies quite young in 1837, and similarly in the United States, a Shaker movement, which was one of these religious utopian communities that popped up, affiliated with Quakers. About 60 of them existed by 1837. They also started to be visited by spirits, but these were those of Native Americans. And Doyle wonders aloud in the text of why Native American mysticism plays such a part in spiritual movements, and really seems baffled by this question, which strikes me as having a very obvious answer, but we'll be getting to that question a little later on. So the next major figure that Doyle talks about is Andrew Jackson Davis, who was born in 1826 to a poor family in rural New York on the Hudson River near Poughkeepsie. His father was a drunken tanner, and his mother was illiterate and very superstitious. He claims to have developed psychic powers in later boyhood. However, when he sees a traveling showman exhibiting mesmerism to his village, this is where he really developed an interest and a path down this kind of work. The traveling showman mesmerized Davis, and this experience, being mesmerized and put in a trance, I guess, was his calling later in life. So he worked with a local tailor and mesmerist named Livingston, who would mesmerize him, and he would experience clairvoyance and the sight of the unseen. So Davis was used by Livingston for certain medical diagnoses. I guess he could see what was happening inside of the body, so he would be mesmerized and then take this X-ray look inside somebody's body to see if there's something wrong with their liver or their blood or what have you. His spirit eyes were in the center of his forehead. So again, calling back to some Hinduistic theology of the third eye chakra, all that being centered directly in the forehead. On March 6 of 1844, he was possessed by some external force, which led him 40 miles away to the Catskills to two men where he had elevated communion on the topics of medicine and morals. And these two men in question were none other than Swedenborg himself and Galen, the ancient healer from antiquity. When asked profound questions under mesmerism, he stated that he will answer that in his book, which he begins writing at age 19. Later on, he met up with a Dr. Lyon as his new mesmerist. I guess this tailor wasn't sufficient enough to provide him with his spiritualistic answers. So the two of them, Dr. Lyon and him, go to New York City, and they meet up with the Reverend William Fishbaugh. And at the time, Davis was uneducated and barely literate, but here begins having divine revelations. Of these, Dr. George Bush, professor of Hebrew at the University of New York, presumably no relation to the later United States presidents, said, quote, "I can solemnly affirm that I have heard Davis correctly quote the Hebrew language in his lectures, and display a knowledge of geology which would have been astonishing in a person of his age, even if he had devoted years to the study. He has discussed with the most signal ability the profoundest questions of historical and biblical archaeology, of mythology, of the origin and affinity of language, and the progress of civilization among the different nations of the globe, which would do honor to any scholar of the age, even if in reaching them he had the advantage of access to all the libraries in Christendom." So Davis really impressed this George Bush professor, and certainly seems to have impressed Doyle as well. So he begins writing out his divine revelations in books, claims during this period of his life he was directly influenced by the power of Swedenborg himself. Not his ideas, but Swedenborg actually influencing him to write this. He began to attract a great deal of attention, including none other than Edgar Allan Poe, and had a number of visions of the spirit separating from the body at points of death. He had several futuristic predictions, such as electric locomotion, typewriters, aircraft, and sorts. But I think as we see going through this podcast, a number of other people had certain predictions in that direction too. In 1850, he writes the book The Philosophy of Spiritual Intercourse and publishes an autobiography in 1857. And he says, quote, "Spiritualism is useful as a living demonstration of a future existence. Spirits have aided me many times, but they do not control either my person or my reason. They can and do perform kindly offices for those on earth. But benefits can only be secured on the condition that we allow them to become our teachers and not our masters, that we accept them as companions, not as gods to be worshipped." So Doyle thinks it was fully plausible that Swedenborg contacted him from beyond the grave and guided him in writing this. Seems a bit far-fetched for me, but Doyle's on board.
Yeah.
So that brings us to March 31st of 1848, where Davis hears this divine voice say in his head, "Brother, the good work has begun. Behold, a living demonstration is born." So this living demonstration happened also in New York State, quite a ways from New York City, in Hydesville, New York, a town that doesn't exist anymore, which is now either Newark, New York, if we were to use a Delaware pronunciation, or Newark, New York, if we were to use a New Jersey one. And the site is commemorated by the Hydesville Memorial Park, which you can visit, presumably. I don't know if it's still open during the pandemic, but when all this goes away, presumably it'll be back to normal. So, a family by the name of Fox, who were a literate farming family, moved to Hydesville in December of 1847. Statements made after the fact by Mr. and Mrs. Bell, who lived at the house in 1844, and Michael and Hannah Weekman, who lived there from 1846 to 1847, claim to hear strange sounds. And basically, Doyle provides their accounts in an appendix of evidence that the Fox house was haunted prior to the Fox family moving there. But it wasn't until the next year, being 1848, that the sounds heard by these tenants of Weekman and Bell were heard by the Fox family. They consisted of rapping noises, and a rap would seem to be the most natural way to be produced by outside visitors when they wanted to notify humans. Doyle says, quote, "The noises do not seem to have incommoded the Fox family until the middle of March of 1848. From that date onwards, they continually increased in intensity. Sometimes they were mere knocking, at other times they sounded like the movement of furniture. There was a very loud and continued outbreak of inexplicable sounds. It was on this night that one of the great points of psychic evolution was reached, for it was then that young Kate Fox challenged the unseen power to repeat the snaps of her fingers." So this is what happened in March 31st of 1848, where Kate Fox began to communicate with the spirits making all these strange noises in her house. And she would snap her fingers, and the spirit would answer by a knock, and the two would communicate with one another that way. Doyle says, quote, according to its own account, he was a spirit. He had been injured in that house. He rapped out the name of a former occupant who had injured him. He was 31 years old at the time of death, for which he was 5 years before, and he had been murdered for money. He had been buried in the cellar 10 feet deep. So of this event, in March 31st of 1848, Doyle says, quote, it was the small root out of which sprang so great of a tree, and is almost universally considered to be the beginning of the spiritualist movement by practicing spiritualists themselves. Kate and her sisters, Margareta and Leah, demonstrate their abilities in numerous places, and by 1850 are conducting public seances. So the spiritualist movement spreads through the Quakers by them, which is something we covered briefly in episode 10 in the work of Annie Denton Cridge. Nice. In her book, Ghost of Futures Past, Spiritualism and Cultural Politics of 19th Century America, Molly McGarry notes that after publications in newspapers report on the Fox sisters, similar incidents begin happening all over the nation, and it spreads to Britain by the early 1850s. In 1854, 15,000 people signed a petition introduced by Illinois Senator James Shields to the United States Congress, urging an official investigation of the new spiritualist sensation, which didn't go anywhere, but it shows that a lot of people were petitioning government to investigate about this. By 1856, it reaches the height of popularity, with an upper bound estimated of 11 million adherents at its peak. And at the time, America only had a total population of 25 million people. So it's a huge, huge percentage of American population at the time.
Yeah, that's almost half right there.
Yeah, exactly.
I believe in this.
Yeah.
So what was the end goal of the investigation, or what would have been the end goal, I wonder?
I'm not exactly sure. I'm assuming to, I don't know, have some scientific inquiry into it.
Official recognition of some kind.
And like perhaps they did with Mesmer and his claims.
Right, yeah.
Assess the validity, and if it can be ascertained in a positive manner, then build upon it. Make some, I guess, government office of spiritualistic matters or something like that. And probably the same idea that Sims had with petitioning the government to explore Antarctica or the Arctic pole and all that.
Find my holes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So the spiritualist movement has been linked by Anne Browd in her work Radical Spirits with emerging political movements such as abolitionist, temperance, suffragette, and vegetarian movements, as well as free love, which again, we touch more on that in episode 10, so we're not going to go too far into it here. But her linking spiritualism with these feminist movements is controversial among a lot of contemporary feminists for linking the two of them. Well, I should say contemporary feminists, contemporary to Anne Browd, who was writing in the 80s. So Molly McGarry specifically cites post-second wave academic feminists are specifically cited as wanting to paint the movement as natural and not rooted in the supernatural. So they didn't really like the fact that a good part of it was linked with contact from beyond. And by the 1960s, that was seen as a little far-fetched. By 1888, Margareta Fox admitted the entire thing from 1848 was a fraud. And her account was republished in the 1921 book A Magician Among the Spirits, written by Houdini, of all people. And in this, she's quoted as saying, quote, when we went to bed at night, we used to tie an apple to a string and move the string up and down, causing the apple to bump on the floor. Or we would drop the apple on the floor, making strange noises every time it would rebound. Mother listened to this for a time. She would not understand it and did not suspect us as being capable of a trick because we were so young. Her public recanting of the events of 1848 basically threw all their credibility away and completely ruined them. And they all died in poverty. So it's a kind of sad end to their story. But Doyle doesn't mention their recanting of this at all.
No, those kind of things don't seem to have bothered him.
Yeah, right.
Because he had his own personal experience with something that turned out to be a fraud.
Yeah.
And he still maintained up till the end that that was what really opened his mind to the possibilities of spiritualism.
Right.
So he just doesn't seem to take note of that.
Yeah, and I read that some people, after they made this recant of their experiences, said that the confession was forced or somebody paid them a lot of money to say this or something like that, that the confession was what was false, not the original story. So a lot of spiritualists didn't buy that, but I guess casual people interested in it, it ruined all their credibility. So it's very unfortunate for them. Christine Ferguson, in her book Determined Spirits, Eugenics, Heredity, and Racial Regeneration, in Anglo-American spiritualist writing from 1848 to 1930, says that the true believers thought this confession was coerced. And Ferguson, in her book, pushes back on a lot of the progressive angles of radical spirits, not from the same angle that the second wave feminists were coming from, viewing feminism as a rational-based movement, not something based in the supernatural, but rather says that radical spirits tends to, I guess, inflate some of the progressive angles, especially the abolitionist element, noting that the spiritualist movement was almost overwhelmingly white, and that they had a very kind of racist fetishization of Native Americans and Native American mysticism, as well as indigenous African mysticism and certain Western and Eastern cultures.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And you see this a lot in kind of New Age movements today, where a lot of it is drawn from Eastern mysticism, like Japanese and Chinese theology, as well as Hinduism, Buddhism, by overwhelmingly white practitioners. So that element is still there, I think, in this kind of spiritualistic movement. Even though spiritualism has declined, it has taken some other forms in various other New Age religions that have popped up that kind of rebrand the same ideas just under a different name.
Yeah, and seances are still a huge part of popular culture.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Even if they're made fun of a lot of the time, but yeah, that's not going away.
No, certainly not. And again, that's more of a horror thing, especially once we get past like the 1930s and 40s. I think you see less of that in science fiction, but certainly there's some there. So despite all this, Doyle still took the movement very seriously, as his book was written in 1926, which was pretty late on. Radical Spirits notes that spiritualism declined as a progressive social force in the 1870s, so the two movements really started to detach themselves around that time, and the movement altogether declines in the 1890s. So Doyle was writing this a good 30 years later, obviously a passion of his, and he was obviously a believer in it. And there were other people who might be, well, maybe not as well known, but Thomas Watson, the assistant to Alexander Graham Bell, imagined the telephone as an aid to a spiritual connection, and a lot of physicists, such as Crookes, being a major figure who is mentioned by name in a couple of the stories we're going to be reading tonight. So that kind of gives us a overview of the spiritualist movement in a nutshell. I think after 1848, we didn't really look into some of the bigger names there because we're more of a literature podcast, so we're going to take a look at the stories that revolve around these ideas, the ideas of mediums, and the ideas of conducting seances and detaching of spirits after death. The first author we're going to be looking at tonight is Leopoldo Lugones, who comes to us from Argentina. And he was born on June 13th, 1874, and died on February 18th, 1938. He was a very, very prolific author of short stories and poetry, as well as nonfiction. Borges, while initially critical of his work, eventually referred to him as the greatest writer of Argentina. He was also heavily involved in politics and was a supporter of the 1930 Argentine coup, which was instigated by General Jose Felix Uriburu and was supported by the Nationalists. The situation, I guess, didn't unfold in the way he wanted, so he committed suicide by taking a mixture of whiskey and cyanide. The two short stories we're going to be looking at tonight were both published in the 1906 short story collection Strange Forces. We're also going to be covering another one of the stories from Strange Forces later on, but it didn't really fit with tonight's theme, so we figured we'll do it for another episode. This anthology has been translated into English twice before, once by Gilbert Alter Gilbert in 2001, and the other one by Daniel Bernardo in 2020. So this might appear to be a bit of a duplication of effort on my part, but When I did these translations, the Alter one was not available, or at least not easily available. It seemed very difficult to find. And I wasn't aware of the 2020 one, so we figured it'd just be easier to do it this way than to try to track down the 2001 version and spend a whole lot of money on it.
Chrononauts Translation Office.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So we've mentioned this before, but this is a spoiler podcast, and we really want to emphasize this for this segment because these are two very short stories that are quite punchy. And instead of skipping to the next segment, we strongly recommend that you just pause the podcast here and read the two stories on our blogspot because they're very, very short. And I think knowing the end kind of takes away the punch. Cause,
there's no point in there's no point in us sort of going through a summary to talk about it because the stories are short and punchy, like you said.
Read them if you can. They're very short. I thought they were also very good. They are very much reminded me of a Edgar Allan Poe if we were from Argentina instead of the Mid-Atlantic United States. So with that said, and that warning given, we're going to get into the two stories. The first of which is an inexplicable phenomenon. So this starts off with an anonymous narrator traveling through the lands between Cordoba and Santa Fe in Argentina, two cities roughly 225 miles apart from one another. He's advised by the locals to avoid the poor lodgings in this area and is eventually directed to the house of this certain eccentric Englishman who's a little temperamental, and he has this dull house in this kind of ugly modern constructed village, but is eventually invited into his house and is allowed to stay there. But he immediately sees the host of the house behaving very strangely, and he keeps focusing on a certain spot in the room. The host, also unnamed, is a homeopath, and the two get to talking about spiritualism as well as magnetism and mesmerism, which both the narrator and the host are quite familiar with. The narrator says he can identify a problem in Reichenbach's work, who was a German physicist, and he's also mentioned in the other story that we're covering tonight, but I provided some background on the many scientists that Lugones talks about in the next story in an appendix on the blog spot. So quite a bit of scientists he drops in these two stories.
Yeah, there's not a lot of name dropping.
Yeah.
Which Poe does as well. So
yes.
The comparison, again, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So they kind of get in this little argument on the nature of hallucination. And the host talks about his time in India, where he met with the yogis and photographs their spiritual work and takes this as proof because he says that chemicals do not hallucinate. And after this, he begins to study their powers. And he feels the power slowly growing in him and resolves himself to see his double one night, which he easily attains, but his double is in the shape of this hideous monkey who mocks him wherever he goes. He asks the narrator to observe his shadow and draw what he sees, and the narrator draws the silhouette of a monkey staring at them. So, yeah, it's a short story. It goes by very quick, but it takes a pretty cool, dark tone about halfway through, I would say. And, yeah, I like this one a lot.
Yeah, it reminded me of definitely some later horror stories. There's a couple, one by John Wyndham and another one by Clark Ashton Smith, where people are pursued by shadows for various reasons, and they kind of haunt them, and they can't get rid of them. So it seemed like a warning of sorts, as M.R. James would say, a warning to the curious. You want to see this spiritual double, and it stays with you forever.
Yeah, right.
Once you access it, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's not like he came out of a trance and the monkey was not there. Now it's there forever, and he won't be able to get rid of it, I guess.
Right, yeah. Be careful what you wish for when you're dealing with these strange and powerful forces.
Now, both these stories actually made me think, what was Lugones' own position on spiritualism?
Yeah, so both this and the next story tie it to actual physicists who were conducting research in this area. So it wasn't taken as a fringe pseudoscience in the time that he was writing this, but it was being investigated as a legitimate phenomenon. And he heavily name checks a lot of work that is done in this field. So I'm not sure if Lugones himself was a believer, but he certainly seems to have a respect for the scientist.
But both stories are somewhat negative.
Oh, yeah, right, yeah.
So it just makes me wonder, did he think it was dangerous? I mean, he believed but thought maybe it was harmful? Or was it just that it needed to be in the right hands?
Right, yeah.
That's it. They definitely both made me curious about that.
Yeah. These two stories are mentioned in The Emergence of Latin American Science Fiction, written by Rachel Haywood Ferreira, which we've mentioned a couple times before. But one of the themes of this story that they talk about with regards to Lugones' respect for the science is the idea of a monkey being kind of a mockery of a human being, in that the theory of evolution was highly publicized around this time, and that the idea that a human came from a monkey would have been well in the popular conscience, and he was kind of reflecting on the fears of that.
But still controversial.
Oh, yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
But I mean, it makes sense, too, because he would see his ancestor, and
right,
his ancestor a monkey.
Yeah.
It almost seems like maybe Lugones is mocking that as well, but it's hard to say.
Yeah.
Without knowing.
It's certainly an interesting piece. He does keep it vague in some places, but it's also very short. I think he was a kind of writer that had like one idea that he would like to play with in a short story, and just use that space to kind of get that idea across.
Well, I like that approach, definitely.
Oh, yeah.
It works.
Yeah, for sure.
The Poe comparison also has, even the beginning reminded me of that with the traveler trying to find somewhere to stay.
Yeah.
A couple of Poe stories definitely begin like that, so it would surprise me if that wasn't an influence.
Yeah, I would agree, especially considering that this is 1906 and Poe was presumably well translated and distributed into Spanish by this time. I'm assuming even during his lifetime he would have been, but certainly this later on, yeah.
I like that he said, hallucination, a force, not a state of mind.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a different... Most people think of that as internal, whereas he seems to suggest that it's like this external thing that acts upon matter.
Right. It's more kind of a psychic impression rather than something with the brain. And we'll see the technique of hallucination also used in one of the stories coming up later on.
Oh, yeah. It does seem like, I mean, with all the name-checking of scientists and stuff, whatever his viewpoints on spiritualism, which I'm guessing at this stage are quite negative, but it's hard to say. But he does seem to embrace science, because at one point, I don't remember which of the characters says this, or it's part of dialogue, but he says, beautiful, free science, without a chapel and without an academy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know if that's... Again, both stories did make me a little more curious about him, because I thought that he was saying that was a good thing, but now I'm kind of wondering, well, maybe that sort of unfetteredness is what gets people into trouble, and maybe that's kind of... Because both these stories have to do with men of science who are sort of carried away by their ideas.
Yeah, and that seems to be a recurring theme throughout or at least the other story that we're going to do later on, the Omega Force.
An academy would help sort of keep things under regulation, I suppose.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
so
definitely.
Maybe he's in fact saying that that is a good thing. And that it's impetuous to think that science should be free to just do whatever it wants.
Right. Yeah, there's a surprisingly small amount of English language criticism and biography on him.
Yeah, because there haven't been many translations, it looks
like. Right.
That 2001 was the first of the Strange Forces book.
Yeah, and I was able to find a holding in a local university library of a translation and critical edition that somebody did under the title of like selected works of Lugones, but it's like really selected works. Yeah. I think it's only like 75 pages long total, and it's almost nothing from, or if anything at all, from Strange Forces. Certainly none of the stories we covered tonight. I don't know, it just seems kind of odd to me that he doesn't really get a lot of critical attention in the English-speaking world, given that these are pretty good stories, and he seems to have certainly been popular within Argentina enough for Borges to put praise on him.
Well, it certainly took long enough for there to be a translation, so, I mean, I imagine if that had happened earlier, we might be hearing more about him.
Yeah, that's true.
On this side.
Yeah.
So there's not a ton of humor, but there is some. He kind of saves it for the last line, because the last line of the story is, "For the record, I don't know how to draw."
Yeah.
Oh no. And he drew this perfect monkey.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, something that Poe liked to inject into his stories a little bit too. Although Poe's humor is usually a little bit dark and strange, but it's definitely there.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And there's a bit of humor in the next one too.
I think that's about it. I mean, it's a really short story. You just have to read it.
Yeah, it's cool though. So the other one we covered tonight, also a part of Strange Forces, is the Psychon, which also focuses around famous scientists and doctors and all that. So in this case, we do actually have a name of Dr. Pauline, who the narrator, which is also anonymous in this one, says is a pseudonym of a famous scientist. And he arrived in the capital of Buenos Aires incognito to try to avoid any attention that it would bring. But the narrator visits him to cure his rheumatism. And in addition to being a well-respected scientist, Pauline is also a spiritualist. And that's what's actually brought him to Buenos Aires in the first place, is he's conducting some experiments in this clandestine laboratory out in the middle of nowhere. So the doctor and the narrator start talking about auras, which explain the use of the tonsure in monks, allowing it to be more easily seen, which I thought was a really funny part of it. The idea of the monks shaving their heads in that fashion, allowing the aura to kind of shoot up like this flame.
Yeah.
Really a funny visual image.
So, yeah, bald people are especially prone to
right.
being psychic receivers.
Yeah.
So
the sensitive woman Antonia he's working with perceives the halos more clearly in bald men, but not in the doctor when he's wearing a hat. So this is kind of what leads him to this revelation. And he's trying to figure out the electromagnetic spectrum of these halos, and he makes a pretty direct comparison to the Earth's magnetic field and its poles, in that your head would emanate some kind of magnetic field in the same way that the poles do. Some time goes by, the doctor continues his experiments, and he follows up on the recent developments in the liquefaction of gases such as hydrogen, as well as the discovery of several new elements, which did indeed happen around this time. So the doctor is explaining to the narrator his apparatus and the methods of gaseous separation, and he used this to make a new discovery. So he's found a new element, a gas, which he calls Psychon, and it's volatilized thought. The idea being that the brain functions on electricity, so therefore would naturally emit an electromagnetic field, and this is emitted in the form of fluidic flaming auras. The doctor then gives the narrator a tour of the apparatus and shows him how it works, and they reduce the gas to near absolute zero temperatures, which just like totally blows the narrator's mind. And for whatever reason, they decide to break open the container just to see what happens.
Science!
Yeah, right. The two of them immediately start acting mad. They're like jumping in the air, making these strange facial expressions and sounds, and they're slamming into one another, throwing things, and just making a huge amount of noise, attracting the...
The guy's notebook turns into a cat or something?
Yeah. Yeah. So the effects eventually wear off, and the narrator realizes that the doctor had created the elixir of madness. The next day, the doctor just like totally disappears. And the narrator doesn't hear from him again until much later, where he reads a newspaper saying that the doctor had been admitted to an asylum, presumably after repeating his experiment.
Yeah. He assumes that he didn't give up.
Yeah.
And that he just kept trying to do this because it was just too good to resist. And drove him crazy.
Yeah. But again, very short, with a very definite end of meddling with forces above you, not producing a good outcome. But here is where Lugones really gets into name-dropping scientists and physicists who were working in this field. For the translation that I did, I put together a glossary of names, and I think there's like at least 24 on there in this story alone. So if you're interested in the scientific research that was legitimately being conducted during this time, Lugones provides you a really handy bibliography in the form of like name checking every single person who was working in it.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I mean, the other one too, but this one especially really did feel like a science fiction story.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Like, it had a lot of the trappings of what was science fiction at that time.
Yeah.
Which is not the case for a lot of what we've been doing the last couple of episodes, or any of the other work today. Well, maybe Nic-Nac a little bit.
Yeah.
Just because of the Mars trip.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, though, this one, he attempts to create that background of verisimilitude in science, and there's also gadgetry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which we haven't seen a lot of, but there's been a few stories where, there's been funky gadgets. Definitely the Edison Future Eve.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And it is a staple of science fiction, and some people admit that's part of the reason I like this stuff is that I like the gadgets.
Mm-hmm.
And
sure.
Lugones has gadgets.
Yeah.
He has the telectroscope and what was the other one? The electroid and the telectroscope. I don't quite know what these are supposed to be. He goes into the electroid a little bit and what it does, but I don't remember exactly what he said about it.
Yeah.
I didn't write it down, but yeah, there's gadgets with technobabble names there.
Yeah, right. And he also goes into this more in the Omega Force, which is also a really
even
cool
the name sounds.
Yeah.
It sounds like the Mega Force or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I agree. This is definitely the most science fiction-y thing that we've done in a while, where you have a character who is actively trying to apply his knowledge of science and engineering, which in this case is vast. I mean, both the narrator and the doctor are familiar with all the contemporary research in the area, which is not light reading at all. I mean, I looked into some of these papers where they were translated into English, and
it's heavy stuff.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
But he's using it to try to investigate something new, to try to develop something that's fictional. And turns out there is no gas that is Voltai's thought, but it's a neat thought experiment. And it's a very simple concept that he's able to effectively turn into a cool little story here.
Yeah. The madness at the end comes so suddenly.
Yeah.
I had to reread a second time because I was like, wait, what?
Yeah, right.
CAD? What CAD?
Yeah.
What?
I mean, it also feels like an act of madness just to break the glass open to begin with. I mean, we're really questioning the thought process.
That's true, yeah. So it's kind of predicated by that.
Yeah.
A little bit.
But yeah, very strange. And the stuff with auras we're going to be seeing more in Nic-Nac, but that's a very common theme of, I guess, spiritualism and animal magnetism in general, this idea that we're surrounded by this kind of electromagnetic aura that generated by the brain and the head and all that. I did really think the line about the monks was incredibly funny. I had a good laugh when I first read that one.
Yeah. Yeah. The ending reminds me of that Nikolai Gogol story, Diary of a Madman.
Yeah.
Where the guy's like, he starts out by writing out some petty grievances, but then by the time he's finished, his diary is like, all the names are just nonsense words.
Yep.
And the dates are like nonsense words and stuff. And it comes on you. It's gradual, kind of, because at the beginning it's not like that. And I was like, oh, it's just some grumpy civil servant or something like that.
Right.
And then you kind of realize that he's not in our reality. He's in some other reality of his own making. And it seems like exposing them to the Psychon sort of brought on some kind of similar transition.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great Gogol story. And I really wish we were able to shoehorn some of his work in for the podcast, but I guess we can't find a clear angle there. But who knows?
Maybe we'll start a Gothic literature podcast or something too.
Yeah. He definitely fit right in there, that's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, these were good. I liked these. They're pretty short, so there's only so much you can really say about them other than what they are. Because what they are is the whole point, really. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely be curious to read more. And we are going to read the Omega Force.
Yep, absolutely. And if you like these three stories, there's the 2020 translation that's available on Amazon, which has the whole Strange Forces, which I think is like a dozen short stories and some poetry at the end or something like that.
Cool.
Again, the whole work is not too long, but it's pretty cool. And I think it's something that really does deserve attention in the English-speaking world.
I agree. Good picks.
Yep. So I think with that, we're going to move to our next Argentine author, Mr. Eduardo Ladislao Holmberg.
Oh, boy.
Eduardo Ladislao Holmberg is someone we've come to before in our episode 7, where we talk about one of his short stories involving mechanical people. But this time he's going to be talking about something quite different. So we're not going to go too much into his biography. We'll just note that he was born in 1852 and died in 1937, and that his primary occupation was not as a writer, but as a biologist. And he extensively conducted surveys in Argentina's ecoregions and described biodiversity in depth. Co-founded the Argentine Naturalist in 1878, which was a biological magazine, and was appointed the director of the Buenos Aires Zoo in 1888, where he served until 1904. Despite the fact that his main work was in the scientific field, not necessarily the literary sphere, he was a pretty prolific author of 19th century Argentine science fiction. And the work we're going to be looking at tonight, The Marvelous Voyage of Mr. Nic-Nac, was initially serialized in the publication The National from November 19th, 1875 to February 25th, 1876, and published in standalone book format in 1876.
You translated this one as well.
Yes, I did translate this one. So this is the first time this work has appeared in English, even though there are several republications of it in Spanish, and there's even a very loose adaptation of it in comic book form, which I thought was pretty interesting. But yeah, for some reason, I guess we'll potentially look at some of those reasons later on, this has not been translated into English yet. But in the Emergence of Latin Science Fiction book, Ferreira notes that the short story from 1844 called Mexico in the Year 1970, written by Phosphorus Rios, and Pages from the History of Brazil, written in the year 2000, serialized between 1868 and 1872 by Joaquim Felicio dos Santos, are the earliest works from Latin America as a whole that could potentially be construed as science fiction. The Mexico in the Year 1970 is very, very short. It's like a humorous dialogue between two people that I think is like 1,500 words max. And I wasn't able to find the original text of Brazil in the year 2000, but if it was serialized over the course of 4 years, I'm guessing it's probably going to be a little longer than 1,500 words.
Longer, yeah.
But this one is pretty short. It's like on the border of a novella and a short novel. I think it was like 35,000 words, so it didn't take too long to do, but it was still an interesting process, as we'll get into the reasons why. Like Lugones, there's not a lot of critical work on this in the English language. So, getting into the work itself, the novel opens up with a brief introduction written by the editor of some publication, and he's putting us in some street scenes in Buenos Aires, which are buzzing with the news of this strange claim from a Mr. Nic-Nac, who is now locked up in an asylum. And we get some commentary on various recent political events, both Argentina and abroad. And it's announced that a few days later, Nic-Nac's memoirs are for sale in the bookstores. And the editor is now providing it for us in its entirety to see if there's anything worthwhile in there at all. So it shifts to Nic-Nac's narrative in the next chapter, where he begins musing on the nature of the senses and the spirit, and he visualizes the image of a black cat. Back in 1856, Nic-Nac had consulted a spiritualist by the name of Frederick Seal, or in Spanish, Federico Alma, the last name meaning soul. Seal was looked upon as a fraud and a charlatan, but he fascinates Nic-Nac, and they begin engaging in this kind of philosophical spiritual discourse. And Seal tells him that the spirit can detach from the body near the point of death and traverse other worlds. So Nic-Nac is very interested in doing this, so he starves himself and dies. And at the moment of his death, he's observed by a doctor who at the last minute tries to save him but fails. So Nic-Nac is dead and his spirit is rising from his body, and Nic-Nac's spirit starts writing lines on a piece of paper in front of the doctor, who sees these lines just materializing out of thin air. And the shock of seeing this kills the doctor, and the two souls begin to ascend up together. So they traverse to Mars, and along the voyage, Nic-Nac perceives the spirit of Seal accompanying them. And when he lands on Mars, Nic-Nac is in the presence of Seal and has this like total amnesic state until the doctor's spirit gets there a little bit later, which gives him all his mental capacity back. As the two spirits are intrinsically linked, as I guess they died at the same time, more or less at the same place. Once we're on Mars, we get a sketch of the geography of Mars, which coincidentally is exactly like the Earth's. And they happen to be the part of Mars that resembles Argentina.
And there's no moon.
Yeah, right. I don't know if they would have known about Deimos and Phobos at that point.
I looked it up. It's funny, they actually were discovered the following year.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
So I looked it up because for some reason when we were reading the Voltaire, I thought that I remembered him talking about them, but I guess they didn't know. Maybe it was Saturn? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't recall either. But I'm not sure if, even if they were known, if Phobos and Deimos would even be big enough to be seen from the Martian sky, because they're pretty small bodies.
Not. Yeah. But they were discovered the year after this book was published, so...
No, there's some interesting links to astronomy history. We even get a name check of Flammarion at the very, very end, who was a very popular astronomer. And
his name just keeps coming up.
Yeah. Though I don't think we're going to cover him, so it's not going to come up that often. So we are now in the part of Mars which happens to resemble Argentina, and we get the names for the continents of North America and South America instead being North and South Nic-Nacia. Quite convenient for our narrator here. Yeah. So Seal and Nic-Nac go to the mountain, which Nic-Nac names the Nevado de Famatina, which is named after a very majestic Argentine mountain. And on their ascent, the plants shrivel and animals cower from them, and they go inside the body of the mountain, where Seal consecrates Nic-Nac, Martianizing them, like all the other spirit images that arrive on the planet from Earth. Seal asked Nic-Nac what he intends to do on Mars, and reveals to him that Seal is the genius of the mountain. And genius is being used in this sense of like a spirit native to that particular object. That was one of the issues I had initially with how to translate the word genius, because when we hear it in English, we think of very smart person, and the spiritual use of it that's being referred to here is, I guess, technically grammatically correct, but it's not very often used, at least not anymore.
Somebody like Clark Ashton Smith would use it,
yeah,
because he likes using words archaically.
Yeah, right.
He has a story called Genius Loci, and it's probably one of his more well-known stories because it's been anthologized a bunch of times.
Yeah. I mean, the Spanish is a little archaic here. Words are spelled differently than in modern Spanish. So I tried to maintain the archaicness of the vocabulary and spellings in the translation. Yeah, certainly interesting in that respect. But after they are consecrated on Mars, a phosphorescent mist envelops Seal and then stretches to Nic-Nac, and Seal dismisses him. So he begins descending the mountain and notices that the animals are no longer cowering from him, and they're quite friendly, and all the grass is growing and the birds are singing and all that. And he notices that the phosphorescence has given him this certain strength. On his way down, he pauses to rest and starts drinking the orange liqueur, the national liqueur of Argentina at that, when the doctor shows up. And Seal was much less kind to him, presumably for disturbing Nic-Nac's voyage, and says he's going to pay for what he's done. And then they see the black cat, which Nic-Nac was visualizing at the very start of his narrative, who starts meowing and repeatedly pointing in a direction, beckoning them to follow. So they start following the cat, and they're led to this great city, the center of which they find a huge plaza and a cube on a column that says Theosophopolis, or City of God and the Wise. Theosophy?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but it was a religion founded by Madame Blavatsky in 1875. So I'm not sure if Holmberg is making a direct reference to that or if it's just a coincidence.
Yeah, I think that in this particular case it's a coincidence.
Yeah.
But it still ties in. I mean, it ties into what...
Oh, absolutely.
The subject matter of the episode. But, yeah, I think in this case it's probably a coincidence.
Yeah. It's an interesting coincidence at that.
Yeah. But it comes from the Latin root words.
Greek.
Or Greek, yeah, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah. We find out that not only is ancient Greek spoken on Mars, but French is too.
Yep.
So our two characters, Nic-Nac and the Doctor, Nic-Nac and Seal, are really the only major characters in this who have names. There's a couple background characters who are named, but the Doctor is just a doctor.
They don't really do anything.
Yeah. Yeah. But they notice that the plaza splits the city into two noticeable districts. They assume that Theopolis is bleak, dreary, and run down, and the bright and vibrant district is Sophopolis. They notice that all the Martians have a pink aura around them, so that the discovery of electric light was not necessary as it was on Earth. And this has kind of hindered scientific progression on Mars, despite the fact that they're more spiritually advanced in a sense. Their technology isn't quite as advanced as that on Earth. While they're looking at their surroundings, they observe a procession occurring in Sophopolis, and they go to follow it. And they notice that their phosphorescence that they had turned into the same pink aura that was surrounding the rest of the Martians. A procession who they start talking to tells them that when a Sophopolite reaches old age and goes to die, he goes to Theopolis, or the city of God, to die and to undertake this death transplantation, transmigration ritual. The Doctor, however, is not paying attention at all, and he's totally transfixed by this white dot in the air. The old man, who happens to be the subject of the procession, is none other than Voltaire, but Martian Voltaire.
Yeah.
The Doctor is still completely transfixed on the white point in the sky, and comes to when the cat starts meowing at him, and he's insistent that they join up with the procession. So the procession goes to the Temple of Regeneration in Theopolis to transmigrate the soul of the person who is about to die. Here, Nic-Nac is speculating that Mars is the older of the two planets, and that life developed earlier there, but had developed slower for the reasons of electric light. They get into some religion stuff, that after Christ was crucified on Earth, his spirit goes to Mars and spreads the same gospel amongst the Martians there. So there's a Christian society on Mars, which they're entering the temple now. And it's huge and has a gigantic statue of Christ. Martian Voltaire is conducting the ritual with the Theopolitan high priest, who evaporates Martian Voltaire's body and causes his spirit to release that way. And it's described as the same kind of evaporation you might notice if you turned on your stove and a drop of hot water evaporated away in a pot. On the way out of the temple, Nic-Nac notices a discreet figure hiding behind the statue of Christ. This shady figure is a Sophopolitan who has a huge glass flask with him. Nic-Nac hears him mumbling to himself about burning all of Theopolis with its inhabitants. Their guide, who is the processionary they were talking to earlier, gives Nic-Nac and the Doctor his backstory. That is the backstory of the gentleman with the flask who is completely mad. And he says that long ago, the Theopolitans settled in the area and were an evil, hypocritical group of people who used their Christianity to further these aims. The Sopholite women are incredibly beautiful and are coveted by the Theopolitites, who create an astronomical distraction in the sky that, I guess, keeps the men busy, and the Theopolites come in and kidnap all their wives and daughters. And the madman with the flask is one of the descendants of these women and is vowing revenge on the entire city. But his attempts so far have been so ridiculous that nobody takes him seriously whatsoever. So their guide leads them back to his house, but not before an encounter with a Theopolite who seems like he might have just killed them in the street if the guide didn't pull them out of the situation. So at the guide, or he's referred to constantly in the text as a cicerone, they hear a loud argument between an astronomer and a zoologist. These are two of the main background characters. They're kind of yelling at one another. Yeah. The astronomer is getting mad about all the noise from the zoologist, and the zoologist doesn't like the astronomer's telescopes and stuff like that. But at the guide's house, one of the guide's daughters totally infatuates the Doctor. And at the same time, the white dot in the sky appears again and causes the guide's daughter, again another nameless character, to convulse. And Doctor said that Seal told him in secret that the white dot is dominant and complementary to his soul, and that the fusion of the two souls will emancipate the Doctor, and the white dot moves slowly down on the forehead of the guide's daughter, where suddenly there is this huge tempest and an explosion of storms, and we hear the ominous laugh of Seal in the background. And this ghastly hand comes up and snatches the white spirit image away and fulfills part of Seal's threats to the Doctor. The Doctor is greatly disappointed by this, but tries to keep himself in good spirits regardless. And they go to tour the academy of the town, the main academic institution in Sophopolis. The guide seems rather interested in setting Theopolis on fire to avenge past insults, and this kind of surprises Nic-Nac that this is the kind of Christianity they're teaching on Mars. The whole message of Christ being
whatever happened to turn the other cheek and stuff.
Yeah, right. But they get to the academy and it's divided into the theoretical and the practical researchers, and despite Nic-Nac's objections, he is put on the theoretical side. And they're reviewing a certain work at the academy, which is a complete treatise on martography. That is, geography of Mars. While they're reviewing this work, the madman with the flask is there, and he shouts, "Betrayal!" And he apprehends a Theopolite who has entered the academy. And this just annoys the president because he interrupted the speaker, who is, I guess, going on at length about the ins and outs of martography. There's some discussion on the nature of criticism in relation to defamation in the law. And after this segment, the madman with the flask asks for the floor, as he knows the means to burn down Theopolis. What he had done earlier when he shouted betrayal was entrapped the Theopolite's soul inside his flask, and this surprises the academics, and the astronomer who we met earlier proposes that they burn him with a condensed ray of sun that he produces in a box. The president of the academy rejects this and says that the enclosed Theopolite must be conserved, and that Theopolites who try to enter should be captured in the same fashion. Nic-Nac is having extreme difficulty in getting any information at all about the local customs from the locals, but the black cat shows up just in time and gives him these yes or no answers to his questions, to which Nic-Nac learns the name of the country is Aureliana, which is derived from the Latin word aurum for gold, which is in contrast to the country Argentina, derived from argentum, which is Latin for silver. So on Mars, the Doctor's character has been transformed into a much more complete, rounded figure, and he's been living as a family member with the guide and his daughter, though he's still in pain from Seal's mockery. The Doctor notes that there's no diseases and ailments on Mars, so that his medical trade is useless, but still wants to live on Mars with the guide's daughter. And the two of them get married. There's a huge turnout from the entire city, and the guide's daughter is presented with numerous gifts from everybody in the town, the most important of which is the ray of condensed sunlight from the astronomer. The guide receives a letter that is not a ray of sun at all, but the spirit that Seal captured, and if combined with the Theopolite that's encased in the glass, will save his soul. So the Doctor must choose between saving another's soul and merging with his soul to attain his and his wife's happiness. The Doctor agrees to sacrifice his own happiness for the imprisoned Theopolite, but at the moment when the Doctor is going to make a sacrifice, Seal again appears in this ominous manifestation and vaporizes the Theopolite. Just totally kills him, I guess, allowing the Doctor and the daughter of the guide to merge together with the soul. And this frees the Doctor from Seal's grasp and power, and they're allowed to live in peace. And observing this vaporization that Seal performed on the Theopolite, the madman notes how much gas is preserved by the evaporation and enters this into his calculations. So the Doctor goes to live with the two other souls at the Nevado, the large mountain from before. So Seal beckons Nic-Nac to stay with him and asks if he wants to go to other places on Mars, and tells Nic-Nac that the letter the guide got from the, purported letters that the guide had received were forgeries from a Theopolite who were trying to trick the Doctor and the guide into this false sacrifice. But Seal probably knew that it was happening the entire time and decided to make this elaborate spectacle appearance to force his own will on the situation. So the two decide to go on another voyage, Later on, Seal and Nic-Nac take flight across the vast plains, and they're going to the Aurelian capital, which is a clear parallel to Buenos Aires. It's a huge city that's in constant political strife with one another over trivial issues. Everything is hyper-partisan. Before they enter the city, Seal asks Nic-Nac if they want to be visible or invisible when they enter, and Nic-Nac chooses to be invisible. When he lands, his body is invisible, but the aura that was there briefly is still able to be seen by the townspeople, and the town is debating whether there were two auras, meaning Seals and Nic-Nac, or just one. The debate rapidly shifts into whether the aura was a cosmic or a psychic phenomenon, and this intensely divides the town. Those who hold the opinion that it was of a cosmic phenomenon back somebody who is named Psyche, the mirror image of Seal, who manifests himself in one of the residents of his city and becomes the champion of the psychic opinion cause. So Psyche is sitting on a chair placed on a cone of sand, delicately balanced. And these arguments break out, and Nic-Nac just can't help himself, even though he's visible, and this is not worth arguing about. But the important issue is if there is one aura or two. As more arguments break out, Nic-Nac's aura starts to become visible again due to the fact that there's less daylight. And Nic-Nac starts flying around and just grabs Psyche and raises him high into the air to the horror of the town. But Seal finds this immensely funny and is laughing in the background. Nic-Nac throws Psyche dramatically down, though not fatally, and returns him to his sand throne. And when he descends, he notices some buzz in the capital that a letter just arrived, addressed to him specifically, which he snatches up. The letter's from the doctor, and he's greatly concerned about some upcoming tragedy. And Seal tells him not to worry about and be patient, and tells him not to worry about the current situation, where the arguments of the town are always going to shift to something ridiculous. Nothing will ever get resolved. It's just a bunch of hyper-partisan people fighting amongst one another over silly and trivial issues for all of eternity. So Seal and Nic-Nac decide to go on other voyages across Mars, and here Nic-Nac cuts the narrative short. And presumably this part of Nic-Nac's voyage takes several years, but Nic-Nac in text deletes a large portion of his work. And when the cut goes back to the story, the two return to Sophopolis instantly, as the doctor is having further premonitions of disaster. So they return to the city, and the city is on fire. Nic-Nac is rushing through the burning city trying to find the doctor, but hears the cat meowing in pain. He finds a zoologist who is really just lost in his thoughts and worried about his animal collection, but he helps him find the guide, and the guide tells him that the Theopolitans attacked the city and kidnapped his daughter. So Nic-Nac looks to Theopolis and sees the madman with the flask about to set his bomb off, but he evaporates before he can throw it. And he then notices that the high priest of Theopolis is there and had used his power to kill the madman with the flask in the same way that he had evaporated Martian Voltaire in the ceremony before. So Nic-Nac sees the doctor and his wife, and the doctor gives the high priest a look of vengeance, which causes the priest to kill the doctor, his wife, and the guide. And it's at this time when the madman's bomb ignites, destroys Theopolis, and in a last-ditch effort, the priest kills Nic-Nac, again forcing his spirit into the ether. And we see the good souls of the Sopholite spirits ascending into the heavens, where the evil souls of the Theopolites are spinning out of control, drifting off into space endlessly. Nic-Nac sees the doctor and the woman's spirit merge into one, flying into the universal soul, so they're together, again, happy in universal heavenliness, whereas Nic-Nac's spirit is drawn back to Earth, and he ends up back in his corporeal body. And here his narrative ends, and we get an epilogue from the initial editor, who calls the work a huge waste of time, which I thought was some nice commentary. But Nic-Nac is in an asylum suffering from planetary mania. So this was quite a strange work. As I had said earlier, this is the first time this had been translated into English. And as I was reading it, I was like, really, it was difficult to translate certain passages because I didn't really know, like, if there's a better way to phrase this in English. But then as I was reading Ferreira's commentary, she provides several excerpts that she translated herself, and my translation wasn't materially different from what she wrote. So I just decided to go with it further. But he's constantly using words that, like spirit image, which translate directly into English as that. I mean, they're basically the same words in Spanish. And while I understand the concept, I didn't know if there was like a better way to phrase that in English in terms of the spiritualistic natures, but Ferreira uses the same phrase, and she uses a lot of the other same phrases here. But yeah, this is a very weird work. It might be the strangest work we've covered so far.
Yeah, very possibly.
Yeah, a lot of the commentary on it, including in Ferreira, talks about the obvious satirical angles of it, which they're definitely here. The capital city they visit at the end is a stand-in for Buenos Aires. The Theopolites are a stand-in for the city of Cordoba, which I guess were like these religious hypocrites that Holmberg didn't like. There's some utopian ideas present in the Sophopolites, but I think the dominating force throughout the story is this surrealistic hallucination, really. Because I mean, Nic-Nac is telling his story from an asylum and has been diagnosed with some kind of mental illness, at least as much as you could do in the late 19th century. But this really uses the technique of hallucination as a stylistic choice, I think.
Yeah.
And it is a precursor to what I'd consider psychedelic fiction. And you could see other precursors in this in some parts of Goethe's Faust Part 2, the Circe chapter from Joyce's Ulysses, and there's some other early works that experiment with hallucination as a narrative technique that I guess kind of predate the new wave psychedelic era, but are seen to me as clear precursors. Now, this doesn't really come together as well as those other two works. It's really across the board, and sometimes its vagueness can be frustrating, but I think it presents a lot of interesting stuff here that isn't entirely apparent if you read plot summaries of it, because it doesn't really do the strangeness of it justice.
Well, I mean, you can talk about that and the strangeness and the hallucinatory nature, and it sounds appealing, but I think I reached my limit with this book.
Yeah, I think I like this one more than you did. I mean, I also did read it 4 times during the translation process, so I spent a great deal of time with it. And it's across the board. The fact that almost nobody has a proper name is frustrating. The plot is more or less typical of traveler stories in that, you know, they go place to place and they see stuff and it's weird and it's kind of cool. But yeah, the otherworldly strangeness that is through the story the entire time, I think, really sets it apart for me. And while it doesn't come together as well as it could have, I do on the whole like this one.
I just don't think it was written very well.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think you did your best with translating it, but even just, there were many times when I just had to reread whole sentences because it just didn't seem to make any sense.
Right.
I'm always the kind of person that's like, oh, cool, this is like a fever dream. I'll probably like it then. And this one kind of showed me up because I had a lot of trouble getting into this. And it just seemed to elude me a lot of the time. I didn't know what he was trying to say. I'm not even sure that he knew. It seemed very vague, like you said.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, very obtuse. And it kind of jumps around plot-wise. Like, I mean, stuff happens, and he's clearly making some satirical commentary from here and there, but none of it's cohesive at all. The only thing that is cohesive is this kind of ominous spirit genius of the mountain in the form of Seal, who's this kind of otherworldly, almost, and I wouldn't say evil presence, but he certainly feels malicious at times. That kind of.
Yeah, I didn't really understand that because sometimes it's like he's helping him go on these journeys, but at the same time he keeps describing him as evil.
Yeah,
and I don't really know why. Like, I guess he's kind of playfully malicious.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, he kind of reminded me of the character of Nicholas Blair from Dark Shadows, who's like this well-dressed Satanist in an expensive suit. You know.
That's cool. Yeah. I think the things that actually do occur are pretty, like, they have this cosmic, horrific feeling to them sometimes, like the people being evaporated by religious fanatics and the madman with the flask and all that. And it has those elements to it that could have been well done, but I didn't think that it was very well done. I don't know, it didn't come together at all for me.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why that is it is his first novel, and it was serialized. So I don't know where the breaks in the serialization were, and what the other content of the publication was. So he might have just been winging it as he goes.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of the stuff that we are doing is serialized.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah,
that's not necessarily a negative thing, and I don't know. It's weird. It's just very, yeah, the satire kind of did remind me of some of those old Greek plays, kind of like the Holberg, not Holmberg, but Holberg. Niels Klim's Journey Underground.
Yeah, right.
Had this similar kind of thing where you had a kind of poking fun at academia sort of motif, which Aristophanes does as well.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And there was definitely some of that in there. But at this point, it just sort of felt a bit like old hat to me. Not that I'm completely conversant with, everything that he was trying to address, but just here we go again with the touring the academy and seeing the old fuddy-duddy academicians and the people and their weird philosophical practices and stuff, and the Theosophopolitans versus the Sophopolitans. And I'm not sure what he was trying to say about the supposedly godly people being the more evil ones.
Right.
It's kind of interesting because they somehow lost sight of their humanity and now they're just like rage-driven fanatics or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
These are all things that sound really cool when you talk about them. But when you read it, I don't know. I was looking for something else. Like nothing seems to flow. The dialogue doesn't really flow at all. There's non sequiturs. Like it just seems it's so all over the place.
It is. Yeah. And he was pretty young when he wrote this, so it was serialized in late 1875, and he was born in 1852. So he would have been like 23 when he was writing this. And I don't think the other one we covered was too much later. But
that one was mostly dialogue.
Right.
I thought at first that this was going to be like that because when after the introduction, which is very obtusely written, by the way, but after that part, it kind of goes into that for a bit where it's just the dialogue, and I'm like, oh, this is where we're going to get then. It's going to be people talking to one another and commenting on the food that they're eating and stuff like the Horatio Corabang story.
Yeah.
But it's not really like that. There's not really a lot of that. Well, actually, there's quite a bit of, I guess you could say it's dialogue, but it just doesn't feel like that.
It's very basic dialogue. I mean, they don't really...
Right. But I also can't imagine characters actually saying a lot of those things.
Yeah, right.
I don't know. I mean, it was funny a little bit in parts in the random interjections of cat meows and stuff.
And the Doctor's got a bit of a sense of humor, too.
Yeah, for sure. And we got the theme of madness. Nic-Nac, I guess he survives his starvation, his deprivation.
Yeah, somehow.
His mind doesn't.
Right. I mean, there appears to be like a 20-year difference between him starving himself and ending up in the asylum, so I don't know what happened to his body in the interim period. They don't really mention that angle at all.
There's some good stuff in the first chapter talking about space, and like it's got that real sense of wonder aspect to it that you see in a lot of early science fiction.
Yeah.
Where somebody, notably the author, is just sort of overcome by the magnificence of the universe.
Right.
And the idea of traveling through that is just so electrifyingly awesome.
Yeah, and particularly the possibility of life on not just other planets, but around other solar systems as well. I mean, he's musing on the infinite nature of the universe, the infinite possibilities of life, and which is kind of strange because when he gets to Mars, we just get a society that's like literally exactly like Earth, even down to the shape of the continents.
Yeah, and that's another thing. Like, there's a contradiction because even on the same page, he'll be like, "Oh, I want to go home," but then, like a couple of paragraphs later, "Oh, I want to explore Mars."
Yeah,
like, I just don't. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, man. This book really infuriated me sometimes.
No, it's fine. I mean, that's part of doing with this. I mean, I did enjoy it, but I could see how it would be very frustrating very quickly because it is dense, it is obtuse, it's all over the place. There's not really a coherent plot or characters or anything like that. It's more of an experience than a novel. And I think you're going to either like it or not. And I did happen to enjoy it. It's not perfect. It's not the best thing we've read this episode, never mind the whole podcast. But it's short enough where I think if you want to see it to the end, it won't take you too much time to do so. 35,000 words, I think, translates into roughly 75 pages or so. So not terribly long.
It felt longer.
Yeah.
It did. Sorry. But
that's okay.
Longer.
No, yeah. I mean, it was an interesting process in translating this, that's for sure, due to the obtuse nature of it. I mean, part of it was just, with the first couple drafts, is just trying to figure out what he's trying to say.
Right.
And that was a bit of a challenge in itself. But yeah, it's an
It did
interesting
remind
work.
me a little bit of that Sing-Off one too, where he wills himself to go to
The sun.
Mercury or
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Right,
And
right,
it's
right.
even the same kind of thing where it's like that one is a servant or something, but in this, his family wants to call him a doctor, obviously, because he's starving himself. And
Yeah.
and he's like, those fools, they don't know that I'm going to Mars.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The literary criticism surrounding this, again, mostly by Ferreira, notes that the method of travel here is this kind of spiritual transplantation versus any kind of technology like you might see in Verne or something like that, which
makes you think, though, there must be a lot of unwitting interplanetary human travelers scattered everywhere.
Right, exactly. I mean, especially if this happens at the moment of death, billions and billions of people have existed on the planet over the years.
Yeah.
But I guess Mars is a close enough voyage for them to end up to, which is why we get Christ and Voltaire there, as well as Nic-Nac and the Doctor.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of the ideas of transplantation and life on other worlds and these kind of ideas are coming from Holmberg from Flammarion, who is directly mentioned in the epilogue. And his works were very effective and well read in the popularization of science of the day. And Holmberg himself is coming more from the science field rather than the literary field, which again seems a little obvious in places due to the fact that the writing isn't maybe as polished or as tight as somebody who has a lot of experience writing short stories and novels. But at the same time, I think it's pointed out by some of the criticism we read that this is a bit of a contradiction in that a scientifically minded person or somebody whose worldview is based on rational thought and
because it isn't
reason.
Really that way.
Yeah, right. It's this weird hallucinated fever dream that we get instead of rational, methodical look at interplanetary travel or what a society could be on Mars. It's not like Tsiolkovsky's story that we read for the moon voyage, where he very accurately describes the physical conditions on the moon. Mars is not remotely described here, what Mars is like in real life. It's just described as literally a second Earth, like a carbon copy of the Earth.
There are certain weird differences among obviously, he says, the Martians they're all Christians, and they all have this, or at least this is what his guide says anyway, they all have this tendency towards intellectual, like adopting airs of intellectual superiority.
Yeah.
For some reason.
Yeah.
I don't really know why, but they're all like that. So I think it's even said at one point that Steele turned like he's actually a Martian.
Yeah.
Like it's not. He's a Martian that's traveled to Earth.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Which is kind of cool, I guess. Aliens among us sort of thing.
Yeah. It's not really clear what his purpose in traveling to Earth was. I don't know if it's just to mess with people or to bring the worthy to Mars to show them these sites or what. They don't really go into any of that at all. And none of Steele's motivations are described, and you can really only guess at them, and it's kind of hard to guess at the motivations of a otherworldly spirit of a mountain.
Yeah, it is. It is definitely. For some reason, that Psyche is male in this.
Yeah.
That's not normal, but
no.
I guess I don't know if there was anything meant by that.
I'm not entirely sure.
It didn't really seem to be a reference to the mythological Psyche, I guess.
No, it seemed more of, I'm not really that versed in ancient philosophy, but the concept of soul versus psyche. I think it's Aristotle, or maybe that comes from Plato.
Well, sure, but...
Yeah, it's kind of outside my area.
But it was definitely female, though.
Yeah, at least how it's personified in mythology, yeah. But I think he's referring more to the philosophy of like an Aristotle.
I guess so. I'm just wondering why he made that, if there was any reason for him to make that switch.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. It's definitely gendered male in the text.
At one point near the end, he starts promising things that he doesn't deliver on in the text. Like he says, he promises excitement in Celia, Protobia, and Melania.
Right.
And he's like, you will witness lawlessness and monarchy and chaos and unbridled capitalism. And we don't really get to see any of that.
No.
Really. So.
No, Nic-Nac cuts out that whole part of the narrative in text.
Yeah, it's just not there. There's the conflict between the Sophopolitans and that is like, again, it's a sort of thing that it sounds cooler to describe than actually to read.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like sort of this grandiose, majestic struggle with people being vaporized and stuff like that. Like, it does sound very, not futuristic necessarily, but like it sounds like it has these resonances of great mythological battles and stuff.
Yeah.
When you actually see it, it's sort of underwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, they get there and the entire city's on fire, and they're pretty much in a state of panic the entire time. And then they start evaporating.
Yeah. The ending is it is quite chaotic and kind of dark because everything is really falling into chaos.
Yeah.
That was kind of cool. There's some things in there about like how we were saying that like he keeps calling his guide perfidious and Seal is kind of described as being evil.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this whole oppositional thing in there that I didn't quite understand. I mean, I guess Theosophophilus and Sophophilis are also part of this. They're two sort of sides of that. Maybe even something that also reminds me of that kind of Eastern mysticism idea that people had, where like inside the soul exists these two sort of oppositional yin and yang kind of forces.
Right. You need the good with the evil to exist.
Right. He says, the king will never be a friend of the craftsman, nor the nobleman of the commoner, nor the rich of the poor, nor the strong of the weak, nor the butterfly of the swallow, nor the dove of the kite, nor the hare of the greyhound, nor the cat of the dog, nor Nic-Nac for Seal.
Yeah.
And I don't know. Why is that? Like,
I think there's just some huge imbalance between the two where...
Right. But where does that come from?
Yeah.
Like, the rest of that whole sentence, yes, it kind of makes sense. But I just didn't, I don't know. Where did this great struggle between Nic-Nac and Seal originate? I didn't quite get that.
Yeah. Again, being a little vague there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, I took that as just the huge power imbalance between the two. Of Seal is almost of an omniscient level, whereas Nic-Nac is kind of clueless, fumbling about.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Yeah, no, I guess it does apply some antagonistic relationship, like long-term relationship between the two. But again, that could just be on the part
of... It's kind of predestined?
Yeah.
But, well, yeah.
I mean, it could be on the part of Holmberg being an more or less amateurish writer and trying to knock out one of those pithy Balzac or Bulwer-Lytton phrases and not coming up all the way.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, you're right. It is interesting. And
yeah. And it does have a place in Latin American science fiction history. I think this is the earliest novella that you could consider science fiction from Argentina. So it's quite early on, and it does have at least some following in the Spanish-speaking world due to the fact that it has been loosely adapted. I mean, as loose as you can be with a story that's just vague hallucination and stuff. But apparently it incorporates some elements of Holmberg's other stories in the comic book too, and just kind of throws that stuff in there.
Well, comic book is a pretty good way to show that kind of stuff, I guess.
Yeah, exactly, because you can really get into the surrealistic nature, especially of I don't think it's appropriate to use the word Victorian when describing stuff outside of Great Britain, but you know what I mean, during that era, the way the technology looked, the way the fashions were, and so on and so forth.
Right.
But yeah, no, interesting, if not the best thing in the world. It's certainly short enough where it wouldn't take too much time to read it, but now it's available in English. It's not going to be the perfect translation or anything like that. This is just our attempt to open this up to more people.
And you did a good job with something that was obviously very challenging.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of our attempt at the Dragon Ball Z or Evangelion fan subtapes, but it got in the 90s. There's always room for improvement, but I think it at least makes it understandable enough. I mean, in the context of this story, it is a little more challenging than the Lugones stories, probably, and certainly more challenging than the other two authors I translated, Nervo and Oliveira, who are much more straightforward.
For sure. I would question my entire ethos of doing translations if I did this one, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. Do I ever know what I'm doing?
And not to repeat the Constance Garnett defense that I put forth in episode 4, but some people, I don't know where they get this idea from, that there's a one-to-one translation of everything out there. It's just languages don't work that way. You have to balance between literal translation and readability, and even if you go towards the more literal end of things, the way things are phrased, even in a language as close to English as Spanish is It's going to parse differently. And
Right.
so, I mean, I have an enormous perspective, even more so now, for people who put forth good translations of stuff like this, especially stuff that's as obscurely written as this was.
Well, ideally, of course, though, the author would still be around when you did the translation, so you could
Well,
talk
yeah.
to them about it.
Yeah, that's also true.
Like when
Yeah.
you read William Weaver's translations of Umberto Eco and Italo Calvino, like,
Yeah.
you know that he talked to them about how it should be done.
For sure. And there's a lot of language stuff, even in the text of that book.
Well, I think, I wish I had more to say about this book, but it just... it was actively feeling like it was working against me a little bit, so
Yeah.
I just kind of wanted to get through it.
Yeah, right.
I haven't really felt that too many times during this. At least, like, I mean, Simsonia was boring, but it was kind of a breeze to just read through.
Yeah, kind of what you expected, where this is
Right.
not really like anything that I've expected before. I mean, it's interesting, I think, due to the techniques we've described, but it's also very, very strange. And it kind of threw me in some places at just how bizarrely written a lot of it is.
So do you think that's the reason there hasn't been a translation till now?
I would imagine that's one of the reasons for sure. Latin American science fiction in general, as we've noticed, seems to be quite overlooked.
Yeah.
We did find some translations of some other stuff, but there are works that have been translated into English by like small academic publishers, and they quickly go out of print and become impossible to find. So there's those issues too, and I don't really think the readability and obscurity of the text is really helping Holmberg out here for a modern audience.
No, definitely.
But it's interesting to say the least, and certainly quite early in Argentina's science fiction history. So I think with that, we'll be leaving Latin America for a little while, and we're going to be heading off to Great Britain. Our final author for the evening, Mary Mackay, better known as Miss Marie Corelli, was born in 1855 and died in 1924. She was born the illegitimate daughter of Scottish poet Charles Mackay and one of his household servants. From 1866 to 1870, she attended a convent school, possibly Paris, possibly Italy, sources are unclear, where she met Bertha Viver, with whom she had a romantic relationship and lived with from 1878 until her death in 1924. And from her relationship, lesbian subtexts also appear in many of her works, including the novel we're going to be covering tonight, Romance of Two Worlds, her first novel from 1886. Despite this, she was a bit of a social conservative and felt that homosexual relationships should be discreet, and was not a public supporter of gay rights at all, and was not even out in the modern sense of the word. In her lifetime, Viver was referred to by contemporary sources as her friend and sister. Likewise, Corelli opposed women's suffrage, and she wrote numerous articles and pamphlets for the Anti-Suffrage League. Her first work of writing she submitted was a poem entitled Sappho, and a nonfiction article to the publication Blackwoods in 1874, both of which were rejected. And after this rejection, it must have stung quite a bit, because she decided to abandon the world of literature and turn to music for her career, focusing on singing and playing the piano. However, she turned back to writing after her father fell ill with paralysis. During the time of her father's illness, Corelli and Viver acted as his caretaker, and during this time is when she began writing Romance of Two Worlds. She was rejected again by Blackwoods for some of her sonnets in 1885, but Romance of Two Worlds was accepted for publication by Bentley and was published in 1886, initially to great success, and was reprinted many, many times. Her later works, Barabbas, A Dream of the World's Tragedy from 1893, and The Sorrows of Satan from 1895 were enormous successes. Sorrows of Satan is still by far the most read work of hers today, and for quite a considerable amount of time held the title of the best-selling novel ever. Sorrows of Satan is considered to be one of the first bestsellers ever, and was a major influence for the 20th century bestseller format. Maybe not necessarily in terms of plot, but in tone and commercial application. Corelli's works sold more than Arthur Conan Doyle, H.G. Wells, and Rudyard Kipling's combined. And about a dozen of her novels sold about 100,000 copies per year, which, when compared to Wells's most commercially successful work, which sold only 15,000 copies a year. So there's an enormous difference here in the amount of books she sold. And she's another one of these cases of somebody who was enormously popular in her time, but after her death, she fell into almost total obscurity.
Right. I don't know that I've really heard of her till recently.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it was quite doing this project, but we had already started doing the podcast for sure. And I was just kind of looking at reviews and stuff and sort of hunting things. And I came across somebody talking about her, and I think they were referring to this book. Now I'm not too sure. And I think that was the first time I'd even heard about her.
Yeah, I think this is the only, I guess we could call it science fiction adjacent. It does have some elements, but she mostly wrote like occult type fiction.
Yeah.
Which, there's some overlap here, probably more overlap with horror as far as the occult stuff goes in her later novels. I haven't read any of it.
No, the titles are certainly interesting.
Oh, I mean,
she has a thing for titles that make you want to pick up the book.
Yeah,
I think.
It's salacious, and I think it does well with the commercial application. The reason that Sorrows of Satan was so successful is that the publication of that title was more of a shift towards marketing towards the home buyer rather than having readership distributed through a library system. So they were able to move a lot more copies that way.
Look, I bought you this book.
Yeah.
It's got Satan in the title.
Yeah, right. But her work was hated pretty much universally by critics, and she had a lifelong antagonistic relationship with the literary criticism world. But consumers loved her work, and the so-called popular crowd bought millions and millions of copies in her novels, not only in Great Britain, but in America as well as continental Europe. She was friends with Algernon Swinburne and read by Queen Victoria, King Edward, the Empress of Austria, Tsarina Alexandra of Russia, the Queen of Romania, who was Victoria also, Princess Royal, the German Empress and Queen of Prussia, and the King and Queen of Italy.
So I'm sure all that royalty really did a lot for her sales as well.
Yeah,
they talk about it.
Yeah.
It's just like how Ian Fleming got a huge boost of sales and they started making a second James Bond movie when they discovered that From Russia with Love was John F. Kennedy's, like, one of his favorite books.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden everyone wanted to read it.
Yeah.
The attitude towards the British royal family could sort of wax and wane over the years depending on what was going on, but Queen Victoria was very popular. I mean, people wanted to emulate her and name their daughters after her and stuff.
Yeah. And she was on the throne for a very long time.
Yeah.
After Queen Victoria died, Marie Corelli was invited to attend King Edward's coronation, who I believe was the only novelist that invitation was extended to.
Oh.
By 1909, there were over 600 translations of her works. And in Russia, she was mistakenly credited as being the author of Dracula, as the Russian translation of Dracula, instead of listing Bram Stoker's name, listed Marie Corelli's name.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Dracula has a lot of interesting history behind all the different translations.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah,
I was actually looking at that a while ago. Like, the Icelandic translation is basically a completely different book.
Yeah. I think we talked about that briefly on air before, but that's a really fascinating element to the story.
Yeah. And then there's the Turkish translation, which is somewhat different again.
Yeah. No, it's really cool. But yeah, credited with Dracula, sold millions and millions of copies, the best-selling novel of all time, which I think it held that record for at least a couple decades.
Wow.
Her novels were made into at least 9 films, the adaptation of Sorrows of Satan from 1926 being the last one, and that was directed by D.W. Griffith, who was probably the most popular American filmmaker of the time, though.
Yeah.
I can't say I'm a fan of his work. But after her death, her popularity rapidly declines, and she is very little read today. Sorrows of Satan and the Romance of Two Worlds seem to be the only one that get any kind of readership whatsoever, at least if Goodreads is any indication. And, you can kind of see why. Romance of Two Worlds, as we'll see, it feels very beach novel in a sense that the prose is very light and doesn't really do much beyond fluff, but you could see it having a lot of mass appeal to people who just want to read something quick and mindless, but also dealing with kind of a not necessarily salacious, but mysterious type of subject of, in this
Right.
case, spiritualism and mesmerism and other weird stuff that we're going to see shortly.
This book definitely has a message, though. Like,
Oh,
this is a
yes.
message book.
Oh,
This
yes.
is, I don't know that, I mean, I guess some beach reads probably do, but it doesn't
It's
seem
preachy in
that
places.
common
Yeah.
now, because I think authors go more for mass appeal, maybe.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess
Yeah, for
this
sure.
did too, but
Yeah.
you can probably still see it in, like, I don't know, somebody like Tom Clancy or something like that. I guess he feels probably that he's writing to a message as well.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, I think at this time, especially when this novel was published, it was kind of an accident that it got as popular as it did.
Yeah.
I mean, she was a no-name author who'd been nothing but rejected for her previous work before, and suddenly she has this enormous bestseller on her hands, which is like outperforming Dickens and Thackeray and all the other British greats. And I think that's a bit different than the publication experience now, where it's very, very much curated by the publisher. They have a very set formula of all the boxes they want to check and what they'll accept and what they won't.
Right.
But from what I could tell from sources, that kind of bestseller mass market novel industry really does stem from Corelli's work. And while there were certainly celebrity writers beforehand, we've covered Jules Verne on the podcast before, and we're going to cover him again. The aforementioned Dickens was huge, huge celebrity writer. The tone is very, very much different here. And I think the marketing techniques were also different here, which allowed them to get these kind of huge sales numbers. So I guess with that said about Corelli herself, let's take a look at the novel. We begin with this prologue, and Christianity is under attack.
Yeah.
It feels like you're reading a Megyn Kelly segment on Fox News or something like that. But
things don't change very much.
yeah, right. She's lamenting that all these atheists and their science are detracting from the true nature of things. And her experiences that are going to unfold in this novel justify the true Christianity, and she's received the sign from God. The narrator in this novel is unnamed, though I think I'm going to refer to her as Corelli herself, because she says in
Seems
text
reasonable.
that she's half Italian, and Corelli is an assumed name, so I'm not sure if that's what she was going for with this work and just kind of became a celebrity by
She's
accident.
also a pianist / singer.
Exactly, so I'm going to call her Corelli instead of the narrator. Corelli is afflicted by a bunch of nervous ailments, presumably like her father, leaving her unable to work, and she's been seeing conventional doctors having no luck. So she goes abroad with her American friends to Cannes. The Everards are her American friends in tow, and she meets up with an Italian artist named Raffaello Cellini in their hotel, and his studio has this calming and soothing effect on her. And he wants to paint Corelli's face and asks her to sit, and tells her that she has the face of one whom the soul consumes. She goes back later to the studio alone, and she's hanging out with his Newfoundland dog, and she goes to drink a glass of water, but he tells her to stop and not drink it, and this offends her, and he tells her that it's this strange tonic, but not water at all, and he drinks it and is energized by its contents. Leo, the dog, travels by rail as he pleases, and his master is Cellini's master. Cellini begins reading from musings of a musician that he once knew who died during a masterful performance, and he gives her this Eastern wine which makes her incredibly tired, and Corelli then leaves with the musings of the musician with her. She starts having these vivid dreams and is beckoned to follow, and she's guided by invisible forces that form the word Heliobus. She has another vision inside of a vast cathedral where she's approached by a woman in prayer who tells her to write down the word Heliobus.
Yeah, these parts were pretty cool.
Yeah, I have to say. There are a lot of parts about this novel that I did like, and it's really good at setting up the mysterious nature of it. It does make you want to read more and see what happens.
Yeah, I definitely, I mean, we'll get to it, but I was certainly drawn in the beginning.
Yeah.
The first half definitely had me going, oh, what's going to happen next?
Yeah.
Then once I kind of knew, it was just like, okay.
Yeah, right. No, but it does have a very engaging style that draws you in, and you can, I mean, aside from the whole prologue thing, you can see why this was massively popular during the day. Like, it's very obvious that this had mass readership appeal, even from the beginning. But she has another vision in a sparse room, and she hears this melodious voice reading something in a long chant. The universe is upheld solely by the law of love. And then stands and turns to Corelli, who's in fear. And he says, "Be not afraid," and that this person speaking to her is Heliobas. So Corelli wakes up from her visions, and she's told by Amy Everard that Corelli looks greatly refreshed, and Amy invites her out to a dance. And Corelli responds with like weird mockery of the Germans, which I thought was kind of strange.
Yeah. Timely, though.
Yeah, right, of course. Corelli doesn't believe Amy at first, but she then looks in the mirror and is just really shocked at how her entire complexion has come back from these visions. She receives a note from Cellini asking her if he can pick out her floral arrangement for the dance. And Amy starts joking with Corelli if she wants a low-cut dress, which Corelli declines, saying, quote, "I will leave that to the portly dowagers. They will expose neck enough for half a dozen other women." So really social conservatism in dress coming out here. Amy sees the book that Cellini lent to Corelli and asks if they are becoming an item, and she out of nowhere just makes something up and says that Cellini is betrothed. And this really impresses Amy. And Amy starts flipping through the book and just says it's awful nonsense and reads a long part on the kingdoms of the air and is just totally disgusted with spiritualism and how could anybody believe this total nonsense. And Corelli responds saying, well, it's not spiritualism at all. He's quoting St. Paul. And Amy says that St. Paul would have never approved of such kind of spiritualist nonsense, and that's absurd that Corelli believes in spirits. They somewhat make up and turn the conversation to less personal and more trivial subjects. And they go to the dance where the host is a Madame Didier, who is an old-fashioned Parisian in love with her husband. And Corelli's feeling really down on herself at the dance, and she feels she has the air of a resuscitated corpse, though she feels a lot better in her person after looking at the mirror at her flowers, which Cellini got her. At the dance, they meet up with Cellini, and he tells her that the flowers are given life by her. And Amy mentions the betrothal that Corelli had just randomly blurted out, and this makes Corelli turn bright red, but Cellini confirms it that he is indeed engaged and says that his fiancée is not in the country. Corelli waltzes with Cellini, and they have a great time, and outside he's quoting Haste to her and wrapping her up in a cloak. Cellini tells her that the wine he gave her was a medicine, and this makes Corelli really upset because he did it to her without her consent, and tells her that he can't bear an innocent person to suffer. And he tells her that she will relapse into her former condition within 48 hours, and that he will have to have Leo send a message to his friend who cured him if he can give her more of the elixir. So she then asks him if his friend's name is Heliobas, which makes him incredibly startled, but says to come with him tomorrow. So the next day, Corelli goes with Cellini to his studio, and Leo's gone off to Paris with an important dispatch to Heliobas. And she relates his dreams to him, and Cellini begins to relate his story about how he met him. Cellini is initially a painter, and the subject of color drove his work. He eventually lost some of his skill, and his father died, causing him to enter a state of despair. He encountered a woman and her child, and the woman thinks that he's mad and begins thinking about prayer. And he was raised as a skeptic, so he doesn't know how. And he was contemplating killing himself and is about to plunge a dagger in his heart when somebody stops him. And a man tells Cellini he can cure him in a few days. This man being, of course, Heliobas, saying he isn't a doctor, but rather a remedial agent. Heliobas is a Chaldean whose real name is Casimir, and he's directly descended from the wise men of the East. And then Heliobas commands Cellini to rest, who then awakens revived, and now understands the truth of religion and the secret of human destiny. And he also gets his ability to mix paint colors back. So from then on, his paintings were naturally big sellers, and says that Heliobas cultivates human electricity, and he's a physical electrician. Cellini tells Corelli to visit him in Paris, and mentions electric baths and other quack electrical treatments, which were quite popular in the real world at the time as well. Cellini reveals that the letter Leo took described the narrator's case, and he wants her picture before she goes. Corelli then takes an express train to Paris and notices that her lilies are wilting and black. She arrives at the Hotel Mars and is escorted to Heliobas by a young gentleman, and the two get to talking, and Heliobas tells her that he has 12 remedies in exactly 12, all made from the juices of plants. 6 of them are electric. And she tells him the drink given to her by Cellini induced the dreams of him. Heliobas says he did not magnetize Cellini, and she gets pretty offended when Heliobas says that she is like a woman, which she responds that she wants to be nothing like other women, and he says that he's sticking her into an action. She expresses frustration that audiences are not more warm to her musical improvisations, so I think that's definitely some commentary that Corelli had about her own musical receptions.
Pretty open-minded, though, about improvisation. Like, I didn't really think that would be such a thing among, like, an upper-class English woman in the mid-late 1800s so much.
Right, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean...
She says that everything that people cannot quite understand is called claptrap in England. And really gets quite upset about this whole thing, that I guess nobody takes her piano playing seriously.
Yeah. She's very, like, I am a continental woman, kind of, throughout this book.
Right.
And so she's, like, very down on the English and English practices because it's what you do at home.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
guess.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, like, vulgar, not as sophisticated as European, especially Mediterranean.
Right, the French and the Italians, of course.
Right,
yeah.
Classical civilizations, I guess.
Yeah.
Not Germans, of course, no.
Yeah.
Never. And the English are just, like, everything English is bad, especially if common people do it.
Right, which is kind of ironic in the fact that she became a huge success with common people and was hated by the critics. I'm sure they called her claptrap, too.
Right, they probably did, no doubt. And I guess maybe that was even... I mean, you hear that nowadays, you're like, the critics are probably going to be really hard on this movie.
Right, yeah.
But everybody else is going to like it.
Sure,
right?
yeah.
That happens all the time. It's probably happening with Godzilla versus Kong right now.
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah. All those Marvel superhero movies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess so, yeah.
There's like 20
critics
of them or so.
Seem strangely kind to those as well, but
yeah.
I don't know. I'm just staying out of it because the whole thing, I can't even talk about superheroes now.
Yeah, no, I don't really have any interest in the genre.
So, yeah.
So I don't think we'll be doing a superhero episode. But maybe. I don't know. Maybe we will.
Yeah, I don't know. The origin of Flash Gordon might be interesting to go into, for instance.
Would you consider Flash Gordon like a superhero, though? Or is that...
I guess so. I mean, he has a sort of a superpower, and he's like a... But he's not like... I mean, he's more like the Spider-Man type, where it's like... It's a normal person. He just happens to... Something happened to him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I saw a bunch of those serials from the 30s a long time ago, and it'd be something cool to revisit. With Corelli and Heliobas, he prescribes her 2 different tubes, one of which he tells her to mix with bath water and the other to just drink. And he refuses any kind of payment and says that they have a connection and offers her his hand. So she takes it, and then she sees images of another face and form behind him and says that his soul and hers are placed in the same circle of electricity. At the hotel, she receives a letter from Amy saying that Cellini has been out of sight working on a painting for the salon. And Corelli takes a bath and feels electric sensations and drinks a liquid and enters a deep sleep. She wakes up at midday and hears somebody next door playing Beethoven and meets briefly with some of the friends of the Everards and then goes for a second visit to Heliobas and then meets with his sister, Zara, who has a very strange gem constantly changing colors. Zara is a sculptress. They instantly hit it off and embrace and kiss and gives her a tour of her studio. And I think the context between the 2 women here is very much like her own personal life. The 2 seem very, very familiar with one another in a way that seems to transcend any friendship, even from the Victorian era.
Yeah, definitely.
Zara tells her that Prince Ivan will be coming for dinner, who she does not like at all. And then at dinner, the dinner is quite exquisite, and Ivan sounds like he has some unrequited love for Zara. Leo, the dog, comes out to greet her, and Heliobas tells her how he accidentally discovered a psychic link between him and the dog, and forces the dog to receive his thoughts and then act upon them. He then demonstrates this as Leo goes to fetch Corelli's handkerchief, and Heliobas says he does not have the same power over humans to make them act in such a way.
That's good. Good to know.
Yeah, right. He starts to explain his circle theory of external and internal electric forces. Afterwards, Zara shows Corelli the chapel, and they want to spend a great deal of time together, and she says she's 38, which shocks Corelli, who thinks of her as being only like 17 years old.
Yeah, she looks like a teenager.
Yeah. So they kiss goodnight. Ivan thinks that Corelli is one of them, otherwise Zara wouldn't have kissed her. Back at her hotel, her, I guess, host or friends are horrified that she's seeing Heliobas and says that he's a cruel mesmerist. And she relates the story of a Suzanne who was seeing some weird ritual that they were doing, though says he is beloved in the poor quarter of the city. This doesn't dissuade Corelli at all, and she's given a room next to Zara's at the Hotel Mars. And she says, quote, "We grew to love each other dearly with that ungrudging, sympathizing, confiding friendship that is very rarely found between two women." Heliobas' treatments are improving her health a great deal. They begin talking about music, and Corelli says she wants fame. Zara tells her that fame and power won't make her enjoy life, and she tells her to ask Kashmir to set her free. She starts playing on the piano and starts musing on Christ, and is overcome by a strange feeling and flees. She sees Heliobas behind her, and he says she has been led astray by the vanity of humankind. And she asks him to set her free, and he's startled, asking her if she knows what she's asking really means. He says he used to experiment on Zara, but she has grown too powerful, and quotes some lines of Shelley to her. Heliobas says that no soul is complete alone, and is a dual entity, like everything else. So, kind of a reflection of Nic-Nac there, though there's almost no way that Corelli would have read him.
No, we're seeing some common threads in place here, I guess, that were
absolutely
around during that time. So.
Yeah, I mean, probably derived from the ideas that Swedenborg and other spiritualist philosophers. I don't know how well Andrew Jackson Davis was read outside of America, but Swedenborg certainly seems to be translated into a number of languages. At least Balzac comments on him.
I mean, he's even mentioned in Villiers.
Yeah, right.
The future.
Yeah. So certainly in French, and I guess in English too, if he's being picked up in the Americas. Heliobas calls upon Azul to inspire music. Beautiful melodies then arise in the Air Symphony, which Corelli replicates on the organ. She's lamenting she wishes the composition were hers, but Heliobas says that spirits aren't undignified to knock down doors or tables.
It was given to you.
Yeah, right.
Well, these parts of the book kind of made me think of Trouble when they started, smoking a lot of weed.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm sure it's not too far off.
Because I actually had this encounter with Eric Wagner. Me and my friend were hanging outside Wings of Metal. He was trying to sort of get Eric to start talking about Christianity, and he was joking because we were smoking, and
yeah
he's like, we're a bunch of sinners, and Eric, whose voice is remarkably deep for someone who sings pretty high, he's kind of looks at him and he goes, "It was put here for us."
Right.
It's perfect.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and he's not wrong. He's definitely not wrong. Yeah, Heliobas tells her that she's not strong enough to be set free for the experiment, and that maybe in a week she'll be lifted up. He leaves her, and Corelli starts talking with Zara again, and she says that he uses internal electricity with his experiments, and that an internal electric shock will separate the spirit from the body, setting the spirit free for a brief period of time. Zara tells her that her stone is electric, and she'll give it to Corelli upon her death. Ivan is a constant visitor to the Hotel Mars, and he's madly in love with Zara, and Zara just doesn't like Ivan's relationship with Heliobas. At dinner that night, Ivan is singing, and Zara leaves the room. Ivan seems to be getting rather excited at Swinburne's poetry. I'm not entirely sure if Corelli in real life knew Swinburne at the time, or if it was just he was a popular poet that
could be
she appreciated. But he's mentioned here.
Some of these people certainly got around. In the biography of Arthur Conan Doyle I was reading, it, he said that he knew him as well. So.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm sure certainly within these circles, too. So Ivan starts saying a bunch of cryptic things regarding a woman wailing for her demon lover, and he just dashes out of the room, leaving Corelli totally confused and worried about evil influences, and she overhears Zara and Ivan arguing, and Zara feels like they are electrically and magnetically incompatible with one another, and Ivan thinks that Heliobas is just a charlatan. This deeply offends Zara, and she threatens him, and her jewel shoots out this, ray, which appears to be alive, the jewel that is, and he touches her and crumples over unconscious, appearing to be dead, but he isn't, and Heliobas comes in, and he says that she was way too hard on him. He dismisses Zara and gets Ivan to come to, and Ivan's in a state of confusion, And Heliobas asks Corelli to tell Zara that he's woken up. And Zara's getting annoyed at Corelli because of this and suspects that she's been charged with electricity and can shock anyone at will, which is what keeps her features young and in a perpetual state of looking like she's 17. And Zara more or less confirms this, and the two women then tell one another that they love each other. The next day, Corelli receives a letter from Everard saying that they're going to Paris. Corelli says she has 8 days left until she's ready for Heliobas' experiment, and after 8 days, he tells her to go to his room in secrecy. In the chapel altar, the cross starts sparking and flaming, and he expects payment for making her well again. Heliobas asks her why she wants to proceed, and she says she wants to know the reason of things. And Heliobas offers her a liquid which she drinks. He starts chanting, and she detaches from her body and starts conversing with his spirit Azul, a woman. As she's floating through the solar system, Azul shows her Saturn, Venus, and Jupiter, and various other worlds, though none of them are paradises. Azul tells her that doubt of the Maker only exists on Earth, and here Corelli kind of falls off and hears a booming voice saying, quote, "Spirit that searchest for the unseen, because I will not that no atom of true worth should perish, unto thee shall be given a vision, unto thee shall be taught a lesson thou dreamest not of. Thou shalt create, thou shalt design and plan. Thou shalt be worshipped, and thou shalt destroy. Rest therefore in the light, and behold the things that are in the light, for the tune cometh, when all that seemeth clear and visible now shall be but darkness. And that they love me not shall have no place of abode in that hour." So in her vision, she creates this garden filled with children who then sprout an entire civilization, who are not thankful that they were created and deny her existence. She is commanded to destroy them, and says she doesn't want to, and would rather lose her heavenly joy and peace than destroy her creation. And the angel is angry at her because she offers to die for them like Christ, and the angel says that only God can do that. Corelli says she believes in Christ and asks the angel not to forsake her, and the angel agrees and shows her the last circle where artistic talent is meted out. The narrator asks a spirit for the gift of music and says to call their name Aeon when on earth. Azul and the angel tell her that when she dies, she will know heavenly glory, and tell her to return to the earth following the cross. A womanly angel, possibly God, it's not entirely clear, is given reverence by Azul, and the angel says, "Immortal from the star, I save from ruin, because thou hast desired me I come, even as thy former unbelief shall now be thy faith. Because thou lovest me, I am with thee, for I do not know thee better than the angels can. Have I not dwelt in thy clay, suffered thy sorrows, wept thy tears, died thy deaths, one with my Father, and yet one with thee? I demand thy love, and so through me shalt thou attain immortal life."
Yeah, it was definitely like the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. It seems to be gendered female, which I thought it was an interesting take on it.
It's kind of interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
But definitely seems to be talking about Jesus Christ.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
And, yeah.
Yeah, so then Azul parts with her, giving her advice on acting as a guide, presumably for Heliobas, and then Corelli sharply awakens. She's been out for like 36 hours and then relates her experiences to Heliobas and says that her experience is deep and profound, more so than Cellini, who was only able to get to Venus, but I guess she saw the entire solar system, so good for her.
Yeah. Good for Marie.
Yeah, Corelli says that Azul told her to tell Heliobas, "When death lies like a gift in your hand, withhold it and remember me." And Heliobas tells her that she must encourage her electric growth and gives her a parchment containing his private instructions on one, on the condition that she never share it. And on the second parchment, it contains the text, "The Electric Principle of Christianity," which she can share with everybody.
That's a whole chapter unto itself.
Oh, yes, and we're going to get to that.
And this is pretty much where... This is where I started to be like, oh, man, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I reached my point with that.
But before we get there, Heliobas asked Corelli why she didn't visit the sun and the moon. And he says the sun is inhabited, but the moon doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And it's this electric portrait, I guess, reflecting off the sun, which...
It's a reflection.
Yeah. It doesn't really make a great deal of sense.
We've seen a few moon journeys up till now, but nobody has claimed that the moon doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's. I guess Verne claimed there was an extra moon, so he goes a step in the other direction. But
yeah. It's pretty wacky with this stuff.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. There's some discussion that they have on the nature of death, and Heliobas gives her a soothing draught to take, which she does, and then seeks out Zara and finds her sleeping and goes to kiss her, but an invisible barrier prevents her. And she goes back to her own room to pray and worship, and the next morning, Zara wakes Corelli up and receives a letter that Amy will be there shortly. Heliobas urges caution not to speak of the human electric force. Corelli attends service at Notre Dame with Zara, and they meet up with Amy, and Amy tells Corelli that she looks great, and the four engage in some small talk, and Corelli begins playing piano, and she's obviously inspired by this divine muse, Aeon. Corelli begins to explain, but Zara just kind of cuts her off, and as they're leaving, Amy passes Corelli a newspaper. Zara and Corelli go back to the Hotel Mars, and they find Heliobas talking to a Catholic priest, and Corelli goes back to her room to muse on Heliobas's parchments, and this is where we get the electric principle of Christianity. So pretty much all of chapter 14 is an excerpt from it, so yeah. I'm going to read several bits because it's just really wacky. So, God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. He is a shape of pure electric radiance. From the ever-working intelligence of this divine love proceeded the electric circle of the universe, from whence are born all words. It talks about how the electric flame or germ of spiritualized existence cannot be destroyed, and that the earth receives less influence from the electric circle than other worlds, and that Buddhism is an extension of Christ's teachings, as are all other religions on the planet. Christ was sent to establish electric communication between earth and God's sphere, saying, quote, Christ's death was not a sacrifice. It was simply a means of confidence and communion with the Creator. Finally, by his reascension into heaven, he established that much-needed electric communication between us and the central sphere. Talks about the electric nature of Christ that explains his walking on water, as well as some of the electric nature of some of the adjectives that are used in the Bible. It says that Mary was actually one of the radiant spirits of the central sphere, imprisoned by God's will in human form. Those who become aware of the central sphere will have no doubt to the facts of Christianity. And hell sounds metaphorical and takes on an approach of reincarnation into a lesser animal, in, again, mirroring Hindu philosophy.
You can see it in their eyes.
Yeah.
Especially dogs. And you look in their eyes and you know what they're supposed to be, or what they used to be.
Yep.
So
text goes on to say, first, that God and his Christ exist. Secondly, that while the little paltry affairs of our temporal state are being built up as crazily as a child's house of cards, the huge central sphere revolves, and the electric ring, strong and indestructible, is ever at its work of production and reabsorption. Thirdly, that every thought and word of every habitant on every planet is reflected in lightning language before the Creator's eyes as easily as we receive the telegrams. Fourthly, that this world is the only spot in the universe where his existence is actually questioned and doubted. So this kind of summarizes the entire philosophy of electric Christianity.
The manifesto.
Yeah, right. The document signed Kashmir Heliobas. So while she's reading this text, Zara comes in the room and says she wishes they could be together for a little longer, and the two go out in a carriage and they spend the day together. The next day is pretty gloomy outside, and Corelli's temperance not bothered by it, but Leo is howling in discomfort, and they receive a letter that Ivan's not coming for dinner. Zara takes Corelli in private and asks her to destroy the evening statue after she departs on a sudden journey. And she's being incredibly secretive about what this journey is, and Corelli's initially confused why she wants the statue destroyed. Getting ready for the dinner, Zara looks incredibly radiant. Corelli saying, quote, I embraced her fondly, and our lips met with a lingering sisterly caress, which again seems a little more than sisters.
Yeah. She makes a point of always making sure that we know that it's chaste, but some of the other adjectives she uses don't quite sound that way.
No, definitely not. Yeah, and I think the subtext probably carries out through a lot of her other works.
Yeah. So it's more between the Victorian values and the her actual feelings, I guess.
Right, absolutely.
And she probably wouldn't even admit that it was a conflict in the first place.
No, I mean, she was approaching it from a socially conservative angle, which is always an interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah, definitely one of the things that I found interesting about this particular book.
Yeah, no, for sure, yeah.
Because the ideas were so out there, but there was definitely a lot of that social conservatism Right.
Yeah, peppered throughout the text. I mean, she doesn't really go on too many polemics. I mean, it kind of does in places, but it's not like a whole screed throughout the length of the novel at all, which is kind of what I expected it to be based on reviews of it, and I'm really glad it turned out not to be that way.
Yeah.
So Zara keeps saying goodbye, and they mix in with a crowd, and Amy's being kind of disrespectful and rude. Heliobas enters with Father Paul, and dinner is announced by the sound of an electric instrument. And of course, the discussion turns on to the subject of electricity, and Heliobas is talking about its healing powers using Corelli as an example. And he talks about Cellini and how his painting skills have vastly improved. Heliobas hints at a great secret he knows and laments about the pursuit of wealth. As dinner finishes up, Zara toasts to their next meeting, and on Corelli's way out, she passes Heliobas, who looks rather forlorn, says that Azul has forgotten him. The ladies break up into their own room, and it's thundering outside. Zara's reading Poe, and Corelli's playing the piano, and Heliobas enters and opens the windows, says it's safer in a thunderstorm, but it's quite a vibrant storm. Lightning crashes, and Zara falls. A party guest sends for the doctor, and Amy's rubbing Zara's hands and nearly faints. Then they leave. As the doctor arrives, Zara's jewel is no longer shining. Heliobas says that he's powerless to cure her, and that the doctor, Marini, says she's dead, and that it must have been instantaneous. Later, Corelli hears playing on the organ that nobody else does, and it's Zara's spirit that comes to her and asks her to save Heliobas. Corelli hears a struggle and sees Ivan there with Heliobas. The two are with weapons and they're ready to duel. Ivan struck Heliobas in the face, accusing him of murdering Zara, and Corelli tries to calm them down and blurts out that Zara's spirit contacted her. And this is of no use, but the two throw down their weapons and start fist fighting. And Heliobas easily gets the upper hand, and Corelli pleads for him to spare Ivan, and invokes Azul, which causes him to stop. Heliobas goes to pray and asks for Azul's pardon. Corelli tells Ivan that she loves Zara too, and that Zara is deathless.
She actually does it in this really nice way too.
Yeah.
It's a very good way of saying like you may think that you have those feelings, but mine are deeper. But she does it in a way that's not. It's not. I mean, it's sort of condescending, but it's like it's very truthful.
Yeah.
It's like, did you really care about her personality? Did you care about her mind and her intelligence? You thought she was good looking. We get that. But did you really know her? And he has to admit that he really didn't.
Right. Especially not on this deep spiritual level that Corelli and Zara were familiar with. Ivan is convinced to make amends with Heliobas in the chapel where Zara's resting, and the two reconcile, and Ivan leaves Paris. But before he does, Heliobas tells him that he will inherit a huge fortune, but also a shadow is on the horizon for him, and to contact Heliobas when it arrives. So Ivan leaves, and is in kind of disbelief of this shadow portion of his prophecy, and he asks Corelli to send his deceased mother some flowers.
Yeah. It's implied that he'll make him have a Dr. Minoret-like conversion.
Yeah, right.
When he gets old, and it's kind of like he can no longer carouse and have fun the way he used to.
Right.
And suddenly starts to think about his soul and what might be happening. So then he can come to Heliobas and be shown the light.
Exactly. Yeah. The next morning after this, Heliobas says that she was preparing for death and that Zara wanted Corelli to have her jewel. And Corelli wears it and it glows up instantly. Zara had left Heliobas a statue of herself, which she then destroys with a hammer. And Heliobas says that she was trying to make a being who was her twin soul. Heliobas dismisses all the servants, but some don't want to leave. Heliobas allows a couple of them to stay, but casts out the others who do want to leave. Heliobas exits, and Corelli receives word that Amy is very ill, but Heliobas tells her that Corelli now has healing forces, but to keep it a secret, as not to be thought upon as a charlatan, I suppose. And he gifts her the letters of a dead musician, which he places in with the electric principle of Christianity. Zara's funeral procession is led by white horses, as Zara did not want black ones, and after the ceremony, Heliobas gives Corelli an invisible pencil and asks her to write, tells her not to doubt, and that she has been deemed worthy of instruction. He tells her that thoughts of self-will hamper her divine music, and to let the heavenly melodies flow through her, like Schubert and Chopin.
Yeah.
So Heliobas leaves for Egypt and says the two will meet again in Italy, and they go off into the winter sunshine. And Corelli starts musing upon the nature of prophecy and how Heliobas foretold the death of an English hero, Gordon, and concludes by saying, "Therefore Zadkiel is certain to flourish for many and many a long day, while the lightning instinct of prophecy dormant, and every human being remains unused and utterly forgotten, except by the rare."
Cue the angelic choir music.
Yep, so that's the end of the main text of the novel. We get a postscript telling us what happened to all the characters. So Amy's rich, Cellini's a well-respected painter, Ivan's also rich, and he married a daughter of a French duke, and is generally happy, except for this prophecy of the shadow. But I guess we'll get to that when he sees Heliobas and gets that all resolved. And we end up with a bit of a polemic, and that this experience that Corelli went through verifies the veracity of the divine. And then the edition on Gutenberg, which I guess is also in the edition of the collected works, ends with like some testimonials and reviews that she got from other people.
And
I thought that was pretty funny.
It's funny because she chose them and not the publisher. Like normally when you see these in modern books, it's like the publisher kind of adds these, but they're all positive reviews kind of thing, and they're at the front. But this is, she has some naysayers, but she sort of retorts to them.
Yeah, it's pretty funny actually.
It is pretty funny. It feels pretty, I don't know what the right word is. Not exactly snobbish, but just sort of like, she didn't really need to say anything. Just kind of like that prologue.
Yeah.
She doesn't need to say anything. Like, some of the things in the book sort of speak for themselves.
Right.
And I don't think that she needs to interject her authorial opinions, like, so much.
Right.
I don't know.
I get the feeling in her personal life she'd go off on these tangents quite a bit.
Yeah. That was kind of amusing for sure.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's hard to say whether the letters were completely real. I mean, I guess they could have been. I'm sure she did receive mail, but...
Yeah, I mean, I don't see any reason to doubt them. Yeah, interesting
Quite
work.
interesting.
I'm glad it was different than I thought it would be. I really thought it was going to be like a religious polemic the entire time.
Yeah.
And it definitely wasn't. It really read more of like a beach novel, which I thought was kind of surprising in a sense.
It gets more religious polemic, though, as it goes on.
Yeah, it does.
I think in a lot of ways, a modern person's reading of this book will be influenced by the reading that they do now, and like of many thrillers and stuff that have come out since then.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that inevitably they'll probably be disappointed.
Yeah.
As I was, admittedly.
Yeah, it does have a good setup in the first half, and then the second half just turns into this principle of electric Christianity stuff, and it just kind of fizzles out, which is a shame. They seem to be developing a romance between Cellini and Corelli, the narrator, the main character, which just, again, totally fizzles out. They just, like, drop that plot. Cellini is looking like he's going to be one of the main characters in the narrative, but after she leaves to go visit Heliobas, he just totally drops out of the narrative.
It's a hierarchy, though. Like, there's the whole thing is this spiritual hierarchy.
Right.
So she starts on her planar journey, and she goes and she meets Cellini, then she meets Heliobas, then she meets Azul.
Yeah, yeah.
And, of course, the ultimate pinnacle of the hierarchy is God.
Right.
And we're getting more and more angelic, I suppose, the higher we go.
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
So, I mean, and then there's the romance with Zara, which is implied.
It's
not
definitely
really gone
implied.
into too much.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is definitely like, she wasn't really in the book as much as she could have been, maybe.
No.
I don't know. No. And it's not really like that whole thing with her building the statue and Azul, like, forsaking her and... Not Azul, sorry. Azul was his personal, Heliobas' personal guardian. She had another one, I think. I don't know that he's ever named, but it's like when she was astral traveling or something, she met this being. And so he is her, quote, demon lover, as Ivan said. Or Ivan, whatever. I can't always want to say Ivan.
Yeah, right.
But
yeah.
Yeah, like a lot of that stuff is not really gone into.
No.
I wouldn't have minded if it was. Like, I think it would have made it more fantastical and strange even.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like she kept it pretty earthbound, except there was the visions early on, and then that whole section where she like travels around the solar system and then gets to build a world.
Yeah, right.
Like that was really trippy and strange and reminded me of like Alfred Bester's Hell is Forever, when these characters, these really crappy people, are like, they all go to hell, and one of them is like, his hell is to try and create like an Earth that's good, and he can never do it. So it's just like slowly going mad from trying to do this thing that's always not working out.
Yeah.
That's kind of reminded me of that. Like, supposed to show her humility, I guess. There's all this stuff in there about Jesus and the truth of Christianity, and like how much Christianity has evolved from pagan faiths.
Right.
Because but even a lot of Christians are still stuck in this pagan mindset because they think God demands a sacrifice.
Yeah, right.
And Marie Corelli is like, no, God doesn't, like, there are no sacrifices in Christianity. That's not what it's about.
Yeah. No, like I guess it was Swedenborg himself, whose views of Christianity seemed more in line with, like, Hindu and Buddhist philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
Of there not really being a hell as more metaphorical. And the idea of reincarnating in a lower animal if you don't do what you're supposed to do is definitely a very Hindu idea. So I don't know how much Corelli differs from, I guess you would call it, the contemporary spiritualist of the day, but the whole electric Christianity thing seems pretty out there even for spiritualist. One thing that I thought was interesting about this piece is that she seems to have a real disdain for scientists, and she kind of pits the true nature of religion against scientists as if they're opposing forces. Scientists are trying to tear religion down, which is like the exact opposite of what Lugones was going for, because he was investigating, I guess, the same forces, though he doesn't really tie it directly to Christianity, but kind of more spiritualism in general. And he was trying to find legitimate scientific proof of this kind of stuff, whereas Corelli takes the almost opposite view.
Yeah. But I'm not sure if Lugones, I still don't know quite if Lugones was like saying that science should work hand in hand with spiritualism or not. Like, it's just hard to say from those two short stories.
Yeah, he did have a clear respect for the scientists.
Yeah.
Either way, though. Yeah.
Because he clearly looked into it and he clearly knew about them and stuff. And,
yeah.
But it's weird, too, because there is a lot of what, at first anyway, it seems less so as it goes on, but there seemed to be a lot of the scientist in Heliobas.
Yeah.
His, like, when she first shows up at his hotel, I almost had this, like, oh, he's kind of like Thomas Edison feeling, like as depicted in Future Eve.
Yeah, exactly. There was like one part where he has like an electric doorbell or like an electric instrument and that reminded me definitely of the Future Eve.
The doors are automatic, and he has this really fancy lighting system,
right?
Because he knows how to harness electricity, but all this comes from his spiritual gnosis somehow, rather than a scientific one.
Right? Exactly. Yeah. His character kind of felt more of, it's not necessarily alchemical, but some of the occultists that are name checked in like the beginning of Frankenstein, blanking on their names now. But exactly right.
Yeah.
Those kind of characters, he reminded me of like a cut of that.
Kind of like a magician.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Really.
Yeah.
And that's why, again, like it's so weird because, again, I think that our contemporary like expectations of now are so different from where Marie was coming from.
Sure.
That it's hard not to be disappointed because we know certain tropes.
Yeah.
And we think, like, we want to see them satisfied. And it's that whole, like, even romantic fiction angle, though, even, like, we want to see the trope satisfied, and it's like, okay, the woman is ill, and she's looking for a cure, so she falls into the hands of these, like, weird, evil occultists, and at first it seems innocent enough, but they turn out to be dark secrets. And so for several chapters, I was kind of thinking to myself, like, is this going to go horror?
Yeah, right.
Is it going to go like dark? And it never really does. I mean, there is that thing about the Ivan and his unrequited love he supposedly feels for Zara, and that weird thing where that I didn't entirely get, that I sort of started to allude to earlier, but I got distracted. But like, for some reason, Azul forsakes Heliobas, like, doesn't talk to him anymore. Yeah. And I never quite figured out what he did wrong.
Right. Yeah.
It seems like he broke some kind of covenant or something like that.
Yeah, the whole Azul thing, I was a little puzzled by that. I mean, I don't know if it was coincidental or not that she picked the word that means blue in Spanish.
Oh. Huh. Yeah, that can't be really a coincidence, because...
Yeah, I don't know if that has any significance or if it's just coincidence or...
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure she knew what it meant, because she obviously has all this fondness for like classical Italian, French, and probably to a certain extent Spanish culture.
Right.
Like
right.
she's really into being continental and all that. And
Sure.
so she must have known, but I didn't know that actually. So that's interesting.
I think it's a similar word in French.
Maybe. I mean, it's just usually people just say bleu, so...
I guess it's not.
So it could be, like azure.
Yeah. Right, that's it.
Right. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because of that. Like, it sort of subverts the expectations of the modern reader, which in some ways is a cool thing, because, I mean, there are a lot of books that would follow that pattern, and you would expect it.
Yeah.
And this is something different, but it's not entirely in a good way, because there really isn't enough conflict.
No, there's not. There's almost no conflict. I mean, the stuff with Ivan and Heliobas at the end just seems like tacked on. And I thought Zara was a really weak character, despite the fact that Corelli seemed to really like writing her and having her there. In comparison to some of the otherworldly women we've seen in novels like Hadali from the Future Eve or Z from The Coming Rays, Zara just felt, I don't know, kind of not as strong to me.
No.
I didn't really like her character that much. She just seemed kind of flat and boring. Yeah, exactly. And that's the problem with like a lot of the characters in this book. They just kind of don't really do that much. I think Cellini started off to be an interesting character, but he just kind of gets dropped in favor of
Heliobas.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And some of the philosophizing about life and society and the way Marie thinks it should be is pretty infuriating.
Yeah.
And some of it's really weird too. Like she says
very
things,
weird.
Yeah, she says a lot of strange things. For instance, she says that women are not as delicate as men. And delicate here is probably used in the context of being like receptive and like artistically minded and stuff like that. She says women are not as delicate as men, but it should be that way. So she's saying that things are not the way they should be, because certain things in society have directed everybody wrong. And that things were better. She said she contradicts herself in a lot of ways, because she says, well, innovation is good. Like people who get stuck in the same, and again, I think she's thinking mostly of the arts.
Yeah.
She's saying innovation is good, but everything was still better in the old days.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Very self-contradictory in places. I mean, it's social conservative, but at the time there's a strong lesbian subtext to the whole thing. She gets on her high horse about the people of England being stupid, but at the same time she's writing this like beach novel which would be highly popular with the people of England.
Those people. Yeah,
right.
And she's saying that like everything was better in classical art days. She seems to be pushing for open-mindedness on one hand, but on the other still really stuck in this sort of really snobbish upper class English mindset.
Right.
Like it's not even truly continental.
Yeah. And it may even be a conflict about her own birth, coming from a illegitimate relationship between this famous poet and his servant.
Notice that she Italianized her name.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Like that. She didn't have to do that. She did that because she wanted to. She wanted that affectation of being a part of something that was better than the commonplace English system, whose schools don't even foster any sort of originality, according to her.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. It was one of those things where I was, like, especially when you get towards the electric Christianity stuff, I was kind of a little bit impatient with the book, but at the same time, I was kind of always interested in its creator, on how she was formulating this stuff, what she was thinking. Because it almost makes me want to read more of her, because it's sort of fascinating that she ended up caught between two worlds like this.
Yeah.
Maybe even more than two worlds, really. She's like somebody who wanted relationships with women, but also felt they were somehow unseemly, I guess.
Right.
Or not to be shown to the world. I mean, was she like that because she didn't think the world was ready for it? Probably not.
I don't know.
Felt it was...
The sources on her life, I don't know to what extent they pull from personal diaries and things like that.
Right.
She certainly got a lot of biographical press while she was living, and I did draw from some of those sources for her biography here, but those kind of read like puff pieces, and they definitely refer to her lover, girlfriend, whatever she is, as like her close friend or something like that. Not even a hint that there's a romantic relationship between the two.
No.
All that comes in with modern critical looks at her.
Yeah, but even the way she describes the narrator and Zara
it's obvious.
interacting
It's
with each other.
so obvious. Like
she throws the word chaste in there every so often just to make sure we know, but it's like not necessary. It doesn't really take away from what the modern reader would naturally think about it.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of Cavendish in that way, where she added the word chaste, but it seems like an
we're
like, oh, maybe I should stick this in later. The world building part also reminded me of Cavendish, so I kind of wonder if Corelli was familiar with the Blazing World.
That's a good question.
I mean, they're kind of minor points, but they're also equally bizarre.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess my favorite parts were the visionary parts.
Yeah.
Like, both in the beginning when she has those dreams, and also when Azul is showing her all the other planets in the inner sphere. And during that part, a lot of weird things happen that are just sort of like, they're not talked on or dwelled on very much, but they're there. And there's stuff like how she sees that matter is constantly being penetrated by, like, invisible creatures.
Mm-hmm.
It reminded me of H.P. Lovecraft and the From Beyond story, which is actually kind of a rip-on. It is almost totally a rip-on Francis Stevens' story, Unseen, Unheard. But I mean, in those stories, it's more horrific. It's more like, oh, that's disgusting, right? Like, this is not good. This is all the stuff that we're not aware of. And I'm sure to Corelli, this is nicer. It's like, these are divine essences, so we should probably welcome them for the most part. Although somebody's soul can certainly go sour, and maybe that invites some of the less nice sort of elemental, invisible creatures to fly around them or something.
Right.
This is kind of what it seemed like. And
yeah, there doesn't seem to be elements of like eternal damnation or anything like that in her
world. But she has ideas about that too. Like she has something to say about all those things, like suicide, for instance.
Right.
It's like there's two things that can cause a person to suicide. One is cowardice and the other is madness.
Yeah.
And if you want to kill yourself, it's one of those two things.
Right.
And so, when Heliobas meets Cellini, he has to make sure, it's like looking at him and just make sure that he's not mad. She's not a fan of drunkenness at all. I suppose it's excessive kind of behavior, spiritual deprivation, so it's not good. I mean, I guess the characters in the end of the book are drinking wine and stuff, but, like, I guess so she's not completely on the let's ban alcohol side of things.
Yeah, I think it was more of an American thing anyway.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah. Her being a wannabe continental and stuff, I guess she couldn't completely put aside. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I liked the interplanetary stuff, the visions. There were some really good passages, actually, like in that first dream segment. She's talking to Heliobas, but he doesn't, like, it must be his spiritual essence or something.
Exactly.
Like, he's not really aware of it when she comes to him about it. But, like, again, like, the whole offering her opinion outside of the text in the prologue and stuff was so not needed, because she says stuff like, the universe is upheld solely by the law of love. A majestic, invisible protectorate governs the winds, the tides, the incoming and outgoing of the seasons, the birth of the flowers, the growth of forests, the outpourings of the sunlight, the silent glittering of the stars. A wide, illimitable beneficence embraces all creation. A vast, eternal pity exists for all sorrow, all sin. He who first swung the planets in the air, and bade them revolve till time shall be no more. He, the fountainhead of absolute perfection, is no deaf, blind, capricious, or remorseless being. To him, the death of the smallest singing bird is as great or as little as the death of the world's emperor. For him, the timeless withering of an innocent flower is as pitiful as the decay of a mighty nation. An infant's far prayer to him is heard with as tender a patience as the united petitions of thousands of worshippers. For in everything and around everything, from the sun to a grain of sand, he hath a portion, small or great, of his own most perfect existence. Should he hate his creation, he must perforce hate himself, and that love should hate love is an impossibility. Therefore he loves all his work, and as love, to be perfect, must contain pity, forgiveness, and forbearance. So doth he pity, forgive, and forbear. Shall a mere man deny himself for the sake of his child or friend? And shall the infinite love refuse to sacrifice itself? Yea, even to as immense a humility as its greatness is immeasurable. Shall we deny those merciful attributes to God which we acknowledge in his creature, man? O my soul, rejoice that thou hast pierced the veil of the beyond, that thou hast seen and known the truth, that to thee is made clear the reason for life and the recompense of death. Yet while rejoicing, grieve that thou art not fated to draw more than a few souls to the comfort thou hast yourself attained. So that's pretty good, and that's almost like, I mean, if you were a priest and you made that speech, people would probably be impressed.
No, absolutely.
And I don't think she needs to lament the death of, the lack of popularity of Christianity in such a prosaic way as she does in the prologue, when she can write stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think her prose style and narrative tone is really one of her strengths here, and that the weaknesses of the novel are more like in the plot that doesn't really resolve itself in a satisfying way, and the characters are kind of flat in places. But I wonder if as she goes along, by the time she wrote The Sorrows of Satan, which I think was like almost 10 years later, if she kind of honed her craft at smoothing some of that stuff out.
Right, and that's why I'm kind of like, I almost want to read more. And this book was not awesome, but it made me curious enough about her that I almost want to see where she takes it.
No, absolutely, and there's definitely a lot of positive things to enjoy about this work, even though the flaws of it are pretty apparent.
Yeah, she has over 24 novels and quite a number of short stories.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't think that we'll come back to her on the podcast.
No, I don't think so either.
Who knows? Yeah,
I think horror people, if you're interested in turn-of-the-century horror, some of the later stuff would probably more fit that mold due to the fact that it has it like a cult nature. I don't know if it would be technically considered horror, or if it just deals with the occult in the same superficial way.
I mean, again, in the beginning, it almost seems like it's setting itself up for that, but it doesn't happen. And so instead, we have perfect beings.
Right.
More or less. I mean, hell, almost, again, he does something wrong that I don't understand, but...
Yeah.
And then there's a duel at the end, almost.
Kind of,
I guess it sort of happens. Like, I was waiting for something to happen with Ivan, because I thought, okay, here's our one chance for some conflict and, like, actual fiery, like, I don't know. Yeah, conflict. What you look for in most stories, I think, is some kind of conflict. And it happens, but it's too little too late, kind of.
Yeah, it just feels like an afterthought.
Yeah, it's not much of a climax, you know, it's lacking the punch, I guess.
For sure, yeah.
And I guess that just wasn't her interest when writing this book. And I do wonder how much was maybe slightly autobiographical. Like, she might have gone through an experience where she was not well and she kind of went abroad somewhere and had a revelatory experience. I don't know.
Or projecting it on her father, who she cared for several years in his final years, I should say. Yeah, so I think that's Marie Corelli, the most popular novelist of all time for a period of time.
For a while, yeah. It's quite amazing, when you find these things and you kind of realize, as you do over and over again, the more you look into stuff, that like what was popular in its time will not always be, and the things that are venerated from that time may not be.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, people know H.G. Wells now, but they don't seem to know Marie Corelli. No, and
she outsold him by like a factor of at least tenfold.
Yeah, and even people are not always known for the work that they would have imagined that they would be known for.
Right.
It's like Arthur Conan Doyle always saying that his best work was not Sherlock Holmes, and he didn't understand why everybody was obsessed with Great Detective.
Yeah.
But I don't know. That was an interesting read. I I must say, like, the material this time was not among my favorite for the most part, except for the Lugones, which were very good.
Right, yeah.
They were very short, and I like short stories, so that's a factor as well, I suppose. It's much easier to take something, I guess, on face value if it's a short story sometimes, because you don't spend a lot of time with it, so you're not, like, with the Corelli, like, I'm sure she has some pretty good short stories.
Yeah.
Because they don't overstay their welcome, and, like, they have to get their point across quickly, so you know you're not being led astray to thinking that you're going to be reading a horror novel when in fact, it's mostly something completely different.
Right.
That wouldn't really, I mean, I don't know how this book would be if it were written in modern times, but I imagine she would have had to make some considerable changes to the structure.
I would imagine so, yeah.
So.
Yeah. But yeah, it might have been the best group of stories per se, but I think they're certainly all interesting in their own right, and they certainly go to some very strange places.
Absolutely.
But I think next time, unlike Marie Corelli, we'll be reading two works that are still quite well read today. So why don't you tell us a little bit about those?
Well, I'm really excited about the next episode. We're actually doing one of my favorite books, which is David Lindsay's A Voyage to Arcturus from 1920.
Yeah, I've been meaning to read that for a really long time, and I'm really glad that I can get the chance to do so now.
Yeah, I think I first read it around 2005 or 6 maybe or something. So, I mean, and it's something that I've actually come back to a couple of times.
Yeah.
I don't reread books that often, but it's just got such an interesting atmosphere, and the ideas in it are really, really crazy and really psychedelic. And the book is somewhat cultishly popular. I think it's one of those things that, again, sort of experienced a resurgence in the 1970s, in large part. But it's not really that known, so I'm glad that we're going to be talking about it because it doesn't really get covered a lot. What does is C.S. Lewis's Out of a Silent Planet, which is the first book of his space trilogy. So we will be dipping into the 1930s, finally. The book, Out of a Silent Planet, is sort of a response to A Voyage to Arcturus. Lewis was aware of Lindsay and understood the power in the book, but he didn't at all agree with what he thought of as the philosophy behind it. So we're gonna be getting into that. We might be talking a little bit about how a Presbyterian might be inspired to perhaps philosophize a little differently. Actually, well, we'll be talking about it because I'm not sure if he's Catholic or C of E.
Right.
But
yeah.
C.S. Lewis.
Yeah. Right.
And obviously they have two very different ways of looking at things.
Yes.
And I'm not even sure how Christian Lindsay really was in the end. So we'll be talking about all those things, and it should be a really interesting discussion. So
yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to this one.
I highly recommend that anybody who wants to listen to it read those two works, and they're definitely both worth your time. So read the works and come back in May, and we'll be ready to deliver an interesting talk about that stuff.
All right. We'll see you then.
Good night, everyone. I don't have a quippy message about the spirits, but keep your souls in good shape for the afterlife. And
your electric cable attached.
Yeah, your electric cable, which could be Jesus Christ, but could be something else.
Yeah.
And yeah, I didn't mention that was one of the funniest images in the Corelli there. That's it. Jesus is an electric cable.
Yeah.
But, yeah. All right, so good night.
Take care, everybody.